All right, we are live, I think. Hold on, let me make sure. Yes, we are live. What's up, heathens? How are y'all doing? I am the Godless Engineer, and I am here with Dr. Richard Carrier. Tonight, we're going to be discussing a new peer-reviewed journal article that Carrier has been able to put out, get published in the Canadian Theological Seminary Journal. Is it? I can't remember
Not
if I'm
seminary. No, it's Canadian American Theological Review.
theological. Right. Sorry, I don't know why I thought seminary. That was really stupid. But yeah. So, do you wanna introduce like what's the paper about and just kind of give everybody a brief overview before we get into your presentation?
Oh yeah. So this has been a long time in coming. Actually, I'm going to explain in the slides what the backstory of this. But yeah, it's come out. It's been announced, so you can see it on their website. The actual file, like the actual article, is not available yet because it's embargoed while they send out the print copies. So all the print subscribers are getting their copies in the mail as we speak or over the next week or two, and then eventually they'll make it available on their website, possibly for members first. That's just how a lot of academic journals run. Um, but it's out, so love to talk about it, basically. And that's what we're here to see. It's kind of important because, I mean, long story short, like I felt like I was being gaslit by certain people, basically, where like, I mean, being told that the sky is green when I know for a fact it's blue. And so I did one of those things like, am I wrong? And so I like did like a massive deep dive on this question and found out, no, everybody agrees with me. I'm the mainstream consensus guy on this, which is funny. I didn't expect it to be so overwhelming like that. That's how it turned out. The question that we're dealing with has to do with what did certain Jewish factions believe or expect about the Messiah, and often the usual rhetoric is that Christians are the ones who went completely against Judaism and came up with this dying, like Messiah will die, and like no one ever thought that. That's completely unexpected. And this created the sort of like the triumphal, narrative of how the Christians broke free of the stodgy, uncreative Judaism and saved the Western Empire and the world and everything. So it becomes this sort of like kind of silly narrative about that. But it turns out, no, actually, like Christianity was right in the lane of several other fringe sects that were already thinking like this. And so Christianity is kind of a product of that backstory of expecting a dying Messiah. And let me just roll a slideshow and then we'll get through the details. Or did you want to like cover anything else before we go further?
Oh no,
Okay,
we could go ahead and get to the
just jump in.
the
I'm
slideshow here.
right. Go ahead.
I was
I
just going to say that I kind of went through this with you a little bit because I was kind of in the trenches of this like back and forth that you were having, and I too was like, are is Carrier wrong on this? Am I wrong on this? And so I've got a whole like saga on my YouTube channel where I'm responding to not only this but also some of the Pauline verses and everything. So I mean, yeah, I'm right there with you on feel like you're being gaslit and everything like that, and people just not explaining like why you're wrong and everything. So I'm really glad that you did this. I feel like you had mentioned doing something like this in maybe. I can't remember in which publication you had mentioned doing a survey of the dying and rising, pre-Christian
on
dying
my
and
blog.
rising motif.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. But yes, so please
Yeah.
go ahead with
Right.
your presentation.
Yeah. I mean, you know, the thing is, I don't get paid for this, right? So that's the problem with peer-reviewed articles. I never see a dime for this, and it's the amount of hours you have to put in to do a thing like this. It's the opportunity cost is like, I priced it out. It's like $2,000. So basically, I did $2,000 of work for free to do that. That's why I don't do a lot of peer reviewed articles. I have done several. I've got a decent CV, but it's not my preference because it's so much work for so little benefit. Like I'm not getting paid. No one even seems to care, right? Like, oh, it's peer reviewed. No, we don't. We don't believe in peer review. As soon as you publish something under peer review, and like, well, then why even bother? Should I bother doing it? It's the constant refrain. It's like, well, that would never pass peer review, and then you get it through peer review. Well, peer review doesn't matter, right? It's the moving the goalposts thing. We can maybe talk about that more later. But let me. So what I'm going to do is, because I'm having technical difficulties, I'm just going to like stare at the slides because it'll take over my whole screen, and I can't do anything about it. And then I'll come back, and then maybe we can make the
Right.
slides go away. And we can.
Just before you get into your slides, I do want to let people over there on the YouTube know that super chats we will be addressing as they come in. So please send in your super chats to ask Carrier any questions that you might have during his presentation. I'll be sure to butt in when applicable to cover that. So please send in your super chats for that. We will be covering any Q&A, so we'll be taking up requests from over there on the TikTok, as well as I'll be putting up the Video Ninja link that anybody can join up from the YouTube and the Facebook side if y'all have questions there. So just letting y'all know, we're going to get through this first little bit of kind of going over what the position is, what the article is, and just pretty much a free presentation from
Yeah.
Dr. Carrier here. Well, free for everybody else.
Yeah.
But all
Right.
right. Uh,
All
yeah.
right. Let's see
All right.
here.
So please go ahead.
Right. And also, I'm going to go through this really quickly. Maybe too quickly. I don't know. But so because I don't want this whole talk to. I don't want our conversation to be completely absorbed by the slideshow. But I do need to do this because there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation out there. A lot of people lie about this stuff or don't understand what they're talking about and make claims and so forth. So I have to orient the audience to the actual backstory that you're actually supposed to understand to even understand what we're talking about. And so I'm going to go through all of that. So this is the title. That's the journal. It is technically the 2025 issue, but a lot of academic journals are running behind, so that's why it's it's like that. It was announced this month, but it'll be downloaded at the website indicated on the screen in a few months. Okay, so this is the thesis statement of the paper. So this, I think, the one thing that on Blue Sky, a lot of people didn't understand what the paper is even about. This is the paper's thesis, and this is a direct quote. This is from the paper. Actually, I think this is the abstract. An oft-repeated dogma that ancient Jews could never have imagined a suffering or dying Messiah before Christianity should be abandoned. This can be demonstrated by surveying the views of several dozen specialists who have questioned or criticized this dogma from the mid-20th century to the present. They all call attention to a considerable amount of evidence that triangulates to the idea of a suffering and dying Messiah, probably predating Christianity in some circles of Jewish thought. At best, this evidence establishes this conclusion as a fact, but even at worst, it establishes its plausibility as a hypothesis, removing all justification for maintaining any dogma against it. Christianity can then more clearly be seen as a natural emergence from prior Jewish expectations and understanding of Scripture, rather than a radical break from it. And I've put in bold the phrases and words that the critics will ignore and try to trick you into forgetting that these words are there. So pay attention to the things that are in bold, because those are the key elements of what's going on here. And it's the nuance that you have to make sure no one gaslights you into erasing. But that is the thesis of the statement, or the thesis statement. And so what the paper does is I go through all of these 30 plus scholars talking about their studies and how they came to this conclusion and so on. So what is this all about? Why did this even happen? So this goes back to 2014 when I published my first peer-reviewed study on Jesus mythicism, which is on the historicity of Jesus. So that's over 10 years now. Element 5 and chapter 4. So I've had 48 elements in chapters 4 and 5 of that. But element 5 gave evidence and cited scholarship that this is a statement, direct quote from On the Historicity of Jesus, the actual thing that element 5 claims. And I'm not going to read it, but notice the in bold again. It's about some Jews, what some Jews were thinking, or could easily have thought. That is a logical disjunct. So that's another thing. Don't let anybody con you into thinking that or is not there. The entire thesis from the beginning, all the way back in 2014, was the disjunct between either they were thinking this or they could have very easily have thought this. And so that's the thesis. And that'll probably come up later when we get into our conversation. And then I promised a forthcoming article, and this is it. It just took me a long time because it's really expensive to do this for no pay. So why is this a thing? So some unpublished YouTube pundits raised a conniption fit and lied about the claim in OHJ and the arguments and evidence presented there. You can find that side of the story on my blog. We don't necessarily need to rehash old things, but if you want the evidence, it's all there. But this study that we're going to talk about today proves that their contrary claims are all false, and their peers, our peers, agreed needed to be said. So that's one of the things that peer review does, is say, we need this publication out there. It's important. So that's why it got through peer review. It's being published because it needs to be said. And that's one of the things that's in there, as I actually talk about the sort of dogma and who advocates it, and why this survey is needed, because people are ignoring the actual state of the field. So that's today's subject. Now, it's key here. This is another thing to pre-bunk disinformation and lies and so forth. Let's talk about what we are not claiming. We are not claiming these three things. The paper does not claim these things. This is not the subject of today. So we are not claiming that this was the expectation of all the Jews. We're not saying that this was the mainstream standard idea of anything. We're talking about this is actually a fringe movement. There's countercultural sects were talking about this, not the mainstream Jewish sects and so forth. And that really pulls into element 4. When people who talk about element 5 ignore the entirety of element 4, where what I established there is exactly this point, is that there was no single fixed idea of the Jewish Messiah. There was a huge amount of debate and diversity and divergent readings of scripture. Different Jewish sects and different Jewish factions interpreted things differently and came up with different ideas about the Messiah. So there was a huge variety of messianism at the time. And so we're not talking about all Jews thought this, or that there was only one monolithic way that Jews thought. We're not even talking about a majority of Jews. We're just talking about some Jews. There's evidence that some Jews thought this. So we're not claiming that it's everybody. The other thing is that the prior dying models are identical to Christianity. We're not claiming that. They all differ. So the details, the timeline, they're all different. The only thing that's in common, that Christianity shares in common with all its precedents, is that there would be a suffering Messiah who would die, and his death would have something to do with unlocking the apocalypse. It'd be part of the apocalyptic timeline. It'd be part of God's apocalyptic plan. So this is an eschatological Messiah. That's very key. That's kind of the one thing that's in common. Eschatological Messiah about the end of the world, and he dies, and it has something to do with that. But other than that, they all diverge in different ways as to how they conceptualize how this would go. And the third thing that we're not claiming is that therefore Jesus didn't exist. I notice a lot of panic from Christians and from critics, thinking that somehow if they admit that this is true, that they're allowing the barbarians through the gates, that therefore this would establish that Jesus mythicism is actually plausible, and oh no. But that's not even the point. I put it in a section of the book that is not evidence for or against historical Jesus. It's something that has to be explained by your model, whether it's a historical Jesus model or not. And in fact, if we accept this, and we should, and almost all scholars who studied this do accept this, it actually explains a historical Jesus too, and even more than the suggestion given earlier. So if you look at the website I've got there, it's got a link to on my blog with some videos. The one that's the Wichita talk, "You're All Gonna Die," is important because that's the one where I build out what I think is the most plausible model of a historical Jesus, and I show exactly this, how the expectation of a dying Messiah actually caused the Jesus movement. Even caused Jesus himself to do the things he did. And that's entirely plausible, so you can build a completely plausible historical Jesus out of this. This is not a threat to Jesus' historicity. It does knock the pillars out of one argument against mythicism, but that argument was a stupid argument. Anyway, it should never have existed, so it doesn't matter. On a fair, open playing field, this fact that there was a pre-Christian idea of a dying Messiah that fact doesn't change the probability of a historical Jesus or not. Okay. Now, the actual, what you call status quaestionis, which is how are things what is the actual state of the field now if you don't use emotion or what people told you, but actually check and count, do a head count, I think, as John said to me once. There are 30 peer-reviewed studies specifically on this subject, plus 15 concurring experts on the record, meaning experts who say they agree with what these studies are saying. Almost all, that's 45 scholars altogether on the record, basically backing my position on this. So the thing that I put in element 5, all the arguments and the conclusion especially. So that's 45 scholars are with me on this. This is what I show in the article. And almost all of them are specialists, and many renowned specialists in ancient Judaism or the Talmud or the Dead Sea Scrolls. So no one can claim that these are outsiders or amateurs or outside their field or whatever. No, these guys are like on it. These are people with expertise in Hebrew and the Dead Sea Scrolls and ancient Judaism and all of that. And there are no peer-reviewed studies against, by which I mean there's no study specifically on this subject that comes to a different conclusion than all these others. There is 1.5 exceptions that aren't that, right? And so I'll explain those. There's only one peer-reviewed study that contains a side argument for the dogma itself, and the dogma being that no Jews believed or would believe this. And that's John Collins' The Scepter and the Star. And some people will cite Abegg. Abegg never actually argues for the dogma. This is an important thing. So he argues some minor things about some of the texts involved in this. That's a whole long, complicated side story that I'm not going to go into unless we bring it up later. I'm happy to go into it. It's just it would distract from all of this. Abegg isn't really arguing for the dogma. Collins is really the only one who does, sort of. And most, when you run into it in the peer-reviewed literature at all, it's just restated, not argued for. So they just say no Jews would believe or would believe this. Or you run into people outside the peer review making wild claims to support this. But under peer review, Collins is really the only thing you've got as far as an actual significant argument trying to push back on this. So, and if anyone cites any peer-reviewed study at all, it's always Collins. So you always basically get funneled back to Collins, Scepter, and Star on this. So in the reviewed literature, that's one argument in one book against 30 dedicated studies and 45 total endorsements. And even if you make it 2 arguments, if you throw Abegg in there for some reason, that's still 45-2. So this makes my thesis, my position, the overwhelming mainstream consensus of pertinent experts. And that's the importance of this article, to end the gaslighting and establish the physical reality of where the field is on this point. And the article I'm linking to there is just an article where I talk about how do arguments from consensus actually work in, like, what function do they play in academic fields? And it's explaining why, if you've got 45-2 or 45-1, you're looking at the overwhelming consensus right there. Now, so we'll go to the high quality, what I call the high quality opposition. I think the Collins gives us the most faithful opposition to this, the most faithful defense of the dogma that you'll find anywhere. And the Collins thesis is a direct quote of Collins himself. So, attempts to find precedents in the Dead Sea Scrolls for a suffering or dying Messiah have, I believe, been misguided. But the notion of a suffering and dying Messiah eventually found a place in Judaism, just clearly much later. So notice what's happening here. I'm not going to go into all the details of Collins's argument. It's interesting. It's worth looking at. It fails ultimately, but it's a respectable, position. So first of all, it's a softer position. He says, "I believe." He doesn't say it's impossible, it's ridiculous, it's blasphemous, or whatever. Just this is my opinion. He's basically saying it's my opinion. I'm not absolutely sure. And he agrees it exists by the Talmudic period. So he's already half agreeing with me, right? So we already agree with this, that by the Talmudic period, this actually was by then mainstream in Judaism, the idea of a dying Messiah. So also the Collins paper, or the Collins section, this is like a digression in one of his books. It only addresses the weakest evidence of 3 authors. And see, he's unaware of the vast array of studies, arguments, and evidence against him that I pile up in this study. So this is the best case there is for the dogma. It's a weak case, and it's completely overwhelmed by all the other evidence when you stack it up. So now let's talk about the low quality opposition. This is the gaslighting. This is the kind of bullshit that basically is being repeated as if it were the absolute unviolable truth that you could never disprove or something. And it comes from Bart Ehrman, not under peer review. It says Pop Market, Did Jesus Exist? That really awful book. And it is generally a terrible book. But I've just pulled some quotes out where he's talking about this, the dying Messiah, the pre-Christian dying Messiah concept. And these are direct quotes. He says, no Jews would have expected a crucified Messiah. No Jew that we know of would make up the idea, nor could they derive the idea of a Messiah's death from Jewish legend and myth, because Jews had no conception of it. We do not have a shred of evidence. It's crazy and blasphemous. He says, we do not have a single Jewish text prior to Christianity saying this, so there were no Jews who expected even a humiliated Messiah. So that's the kind of hysterical, repetitive position Bart Ehrman takes that is super extreme. And notice how off the wall it is compared to Collins. Collins is much more measured and cautious about this, and Ehrman is just not. It's worth pointing out that Ehrman refutes himself in the same book, because later, when he's dealing with a different argument, he dismisses it by saying, how would we know what wasn't believed by every Jew? Which is a completely valid point. It just refutes every single thing he said that I just quoted above. If you can't say that no Jews had this idea when you just admitted you don't know and cannot know what every Jew thought. So Ehrman's kind of often bad at methodology and logic. So like contradicting himself is a thing that happens a lot, and this is an example of that. But key to this is that he's finally aware that Isaiah 53 and Daniel 9 have been used by this. He doesn't cite anyone, but he just says, no Jews read these passages as messianic. He denies any Jews did, like not even one. That's the position he takes. And he presents no relevant defense of these assertions, on any of these on the page. And he cites no scholarship on this. So he just makes all these assertions. Now, Ehrman only has two arguments for all of those wild, hysterical assertions. Both of them are invalid. One is an impertinent analogy to David Koresh. It's not impertinent because Koresh is a modern event. It's impertinent because it's a false analogy. There's no way to make a logical argument out of the analogy he tries to build. I won't even waste your time trying to explain it. It's just an invalid argument that doesn't apply. And then his other argument is a self-contradictory appeal to Paul, where he says, Ehrman describes his assumption that this was the stumbling block that was turning Jews off. And so therefore no Jews could think of it. But the problem is the exact same verse that Ehrman cites here goes on to say, Paul himself goes on to say that it didn't turn off every Jew. So Paul is the same evidence is saying that there were some Jews who were okay with this, who could accept this. So himself included, by the way. Everybody forgets that Paul was not a mission follower of Jesus who had to reconcile why he died. Paul came in after. So clearly Jews were receptive to this idea and would still remain Jews and still see it as making sense within Judaism. So Ehrman's own evidence here refutes all that he said, right? So like it looks like we have some Jews actually agreeing that this makes sense. Okay, so what does the peer-reviewed literature say? Forget all the opinions and stuff. So this is what I found, and this is what I document in the article. Dozens of scholars agree that the servant song of Isaiah 52 and 53 was already, this is before Christianity, was already being reinterpreted by some as prophetic of the Messiah. And that became the undisputed mainstream view by the Talmudic era. So this is dozens of scholars have argued both those things. They've also argued likewise for the dying Messiah in Daniel 9, the dying righteous hero of wisdom 2 and 5, and the pierced Messiah of Zechariah 12:10. I didn't make up any of these things. There are tons and tons of scholars who've said all of these things and that I could cite and do in the article and show how they explain this. They also all agree that the original meanings are not relevant. And this is one of the most common sort of armchair apologetical pushback you'll get, is that people will start going on and on about what the original meaning was of the original authors of Isaiah 53 and Daniel 9 and Zechariah 12 and wisdom and all of that. But all these scholars point out that it has no bearing on this, because we're talking about apocalyptic Jews who by definition were always reinterpreting these texts as meaning something other than they originally meant. This was mainstream in the sense that like all the Pesher logic of the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot of other Jews, even sort of mainstream Jews, did this all the time. They were continually reinterpreting the texts. And Christianity comes out of this atmosphere of this idea that it's okay to like reinterpret these texts to mean things completely different than what the original authors meant. That's a normal Jewish behavior at the time. It's not something Christians invented. And so when we're talking about this, the only thing that matters is what were Jewish sectarians reading these texts as saying in the century before Christianity. What the original authors wrote is completely irrelevant. Toss it in the trash. It has nothing to do with any of this. What we want to know is, how were apocalyptic Jews rereading these verses before Christianity? That's what we want to know. And that's the only thing that's relevant to explaining Christianity, because Christianity clearly was doing the same thing, as rereading these passages as doing different things. Oh, I heard something there. What was that? John?
Oh, I might have hit. I might have.
Oh, okay.
Are you there?
Yeah. I haven't cut out or anything, right? I'm all right.
No, you're fine. Yeah, I think I hit like my desk or something like that.
Okay.
I got the spatial awareness of a block.
No, that's cool. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't like talking to the void. Okay. All right. The other thing is the Melchizedek scroll. This is the one that gets debated a lot, but every scholar, considering the import of this scroll, which is called 11Q13 is its designation, every scholar considering the import of 11Q13 on this question also agrees it implicates the dying Messiah of Daniel 9. There's one exception of Abeg, but even he agrees that it could. His argument is that we don't know that. He's wrong, but that was his argument. If we get into the Abeg thing, I'll explain why I don't really think he's a relevant author to this, but just to be thorough, so no one accuses me of forgetting the guy. Okay, so the point being is that we have dozens of scholars, or at least a dozen scholars, somewhere in that ballpark, considering this passage and agree with me on this. They interpret basically use the exact same arguments I did, come to the exact same conclusion I did about this. Okay, so the purpose of my study, therefore, given all of that, and this is page 3 from the article. When it comes out, you can check page 3 for this. Direct quote. How or why the overwhelming majority of studies on this question have been ignored or gainsaid may be beyond explanation. I have my thoughts about that, but I didn't go into it in the article. But this oversight requires an organized correction, bringing together a complete survey of the numerous studies against this dogma and their findings and reasoning, which will only be briefed here, but future scholars can use this survey to locate and explore further the details of their arguments. So basically the function of the paper is summarizes it all, and if you want to deep dive any of that stuff, get into the nitty gritty, you can use my bibliography in that paper to like hunt this stuff down and research it further. So now I got to do a little bit of anti-disinformation again. I have to distinguish here, and I talk about this in the paper. These are things, all of these I talk about in the paper in different ways, and I'm doing it more colloquially here on the slide for your benefit, but it's more academic in the article. But there's a difference between the factual argument and the modal argument. Remember that I was talking about that logical disjunct earlier, the or in my sentence. So I'm arguing either this or that, either of these things. If either of these things are true, then element 5 is correct. And it's either probably true that there was a pre-Christian dying Messiah tradition, or there plausibly could have. In other words, we could hypothesize that there would have been, and that wouldn't be crazy or blasphemous or impossible or inconceivable the way Ehrman frames it. So we just got to prove either one of these. Obviously, the plausibly could have is way easier to prove because that's a low bar. I think we certainly well clear the probably did bar. But it's important to note that even if you think you can push it below the probably did bar, you still got to tackle the plausibly could have bar. And that's where it gets harder and harder to really argue against this. And I point this out because it's important in terms of like the different attitudes that you find, a whole spectrum of confidence levels that you find in the literature about this. But what I said originally was it's one or the other, and that's all we got to prove, one or the other. The other thing is word games are fallacious. That trying to redefine Messiah so that the argument goes away is just trickery. That's rhetoric. The only definition of Messiah that matters for what we're talking about here is any divinely chosen man who's essential for the eschaton, meaning the end of the world. So anybody who meets that condition, they're necessary to the eschaton, they're divinely chosen. Doesn't matter how, doesn't matter who they are, if they're a priest, a warrior, none of those things matter. If they are a divinely chosen man, essential to the eschaton, they're a Messiah, especially if they're called a Messiah. That you can't like redefine that out of existence. If they're a divinely chosen man called a Messiah who's essential to the eschaton, that's who we're talking about. That's the kind of messianism that Christianity grew out of and evolved from. So that's the only kind of Messiah we need. The diversity of other views of Messiah doesn't matter, because Christianity might have done some innovative things in their construction of the Messiah, but so did many other Jewish sects. There's nothing un-Jewish or weird about that. And the other thing is the difference between humiliated and suffering versus actually dying. You notice that Ehrman was adamantly against the humiliated and suffering thing, but that's to confuse two different things. There really is no argument against the humiliated suffering thing, given the disjunct, because martyrdom and righteous suffering hero tropes are well established. This is mainstream. There's tons of scholars on this. I cite several here. The examples of the Maccabean martyrs, legends, Wisdom 2 and 5 itself, as it was originally written. Isaiah 53 is even constructed that way. So these tropes were well established. The idea that the Messiah might suffer or struggle or be humiliated or something would fit exactly in the context of Jewish thinking about basically righteous heroes generally. It's a very Jewish thing, and was already before Christianity came along. So that, like, adapting that to your Messiah, of the time, would be like an acceptable and reasonable thing to do. It would make sense. So that really shouldn't have to be argued. There's so much evidence for that, and it's very mainstream. So what I'm going to focus on, what I did focus on in the paper, is the aspect of dying. Does he actually get killed? Is that the expectation, that he would die for this, die for Israel, that he would die for God's plan? And this also ties into why I don't waste any time in the paper on the resurrection side, because resurrection is already entailed in a resurrection cult. So any Jewish sect like that Christianity came out of that believed in the resurrection obviously would believe that the Messiah would be resurrected, because that just logically follows necessarily. So you don't need evidence that they believed that he would be risen from the dead. He would be a righteous hero risen from the dead, just like all other righteous heroes. So that, they could innovate into like when he was resurrected, how he was resurrected, all of that stuff. It doesn't matter to the point here. So the dying and rising Messiah part, really, we only got to prove the dying part. Once we've got that, we've got the rest. The other thing to note is that there is no actual evidence of a universal hostility to a dying Messiah. That's only a theory. So like Ehrman, even Collins, like they're only theorizing that there was. They don't actually have anybody saying this. Like, so there's no text that says there's no possible way that this could happen. Like, there's no Jewish text that's hostile to the idea of a dying Messiah. That's something that people are conjecturing. And even the Talmud, let's point out, when the Talmud, which is very clear pro-dying Messiah model, it's not aware of opposition ever existing. So there's no opposition comes up. It never has to argue for this position. It just assumes it would be no opposition. The Talmudic authors just say it as if it's just everybody agrees that the Messiah would die. There's no one stands up and says, wait, that's not possible. And there's no like alternative views that they compare it with or anything like that. It's just very consistently only one model. That's it. And there's no mention of there ever being opposition. Another point is that there's a lot of the noise and smoke over this, and this gets to Abeg, over which line in Daniel 9 that 11Q13 quoted. Was it 925 or 926? And all the scholars, like Abeg is the only one who missed this, but all the other scholars who do this, even the scholar Timothy Lim that Abeg cites incorrectly as supporting him, when in fact Lim refutes Abeg. So that's a weird note. Maybe we can get into that later. All the other scholars who've done this have pointed out that does not matter. It literally does not matter which verse the scroll quotes, because when the author was writing, the author of 11Q13 was writing, they're writing in the final week of the timeline, because it's a commentary on Daniel 9. This 11Q13 is a commentary on the final week or the final 10 years or whatever, the final years of the apocalyptic timetable. So the fact that it's quoting Daniel 9:25 or 26 here means that logically necessarily entails that the author of 11Q13 had to think that those were the same guy being mentioned in both verses. That in fact, that was really just one whole verse. 25 to 26 is all one story about one guy that it's quoting. So it doesn't actually matter which verse he's quoting. The dying Messiah that's mentioned there is implicated inherently. And there's many scholars who pointed this out. I'm not the only one to have pointed it out. There's, like I said, there's a huge list we could give later maybe of all the scholars who said this. And that's the problem with Abeg. Abeg thinks that maybe it could refer to a guy hundreds of years earlier, but that's impossible, because the timeline part of the commentary that this is in refers to the final years. So it cannot refer to some priest 100 years earlier or 50 years earlier or something. And and again, that relates to the fact that the original meaning is no longer 11Q13 is no longer using the original meaning of Daniel because they're writing after that. And then also Pesher's work this way. There's maybe we'll get into it later about this false claim that Pesher commentaries always and only atomize the text and ignore surrounding verses when they quote a verse. So I was pretty sure that was false when someone tried to, infamous pundit tried insisting upon this. But I researched it. I checked the textbooks written on Pesher studies written by leading lights like Barron, Horgan, and Lim. They all refute this. They all say no, they do not exclusively atomize. They do references exactly like this, where they'll quote one verse, fully understanding you to understand the surrounding verses get pulled in, and their semantic content is relevant to the commentary. So that's just, like I said, mainstream textbooks on studying Peshers. All these experts, they say that's how Peshers work. So there's really no way for Abeg's argument to work. It's impossible. So he's just wrong. And Lim actually already explained why it was wrong. So it's kind of weird that Abeg would cite Lim as supporting Abeg, which he doesn't. I can only assume that Abeg didn't read Lim. He just assumed that there was a line in it where Lim was talking about it was probably verse 25 quoted, and then didn't read the rest of it where he said that doesn't matter and explained why it doesn't matter. But anyway, that's important. You got to understand that, because that's where one of the lying games will come around, is try to argue this point. And also, many agree that Daniel 9 and Wisdom 2 and 5, as well as several scrolls, were already interpretations of Isaiah 53 when written. This is really important. This is actually a mainstream view you'll find in commentaries and updated guides and things like that about the Bible. A lot of scholars agree that the original authors even of Daniel 9, are deliberately riffing on Isaiah 53 when they wrote the Dying Messiah timeline. So, and also Wisdom 2 and 5 is there's intertextual evidence of intertextuality between these, that the author of Wisdom 2 and 5 actually is looking at Isaiah 53 and thinking about it when he's building those verses. So they're actually already intertextually related. And that's already a mainstream view. Not all scholars agree with it, but a lot do. And the arguments are pretty strong. So you have to understand all of that background to really get the rest of this. Then there's the relevance of the Talmud. You'll see a lot of people saying, well, you can't cite the Talmud, it's too late. That's actually incompetent reasoning. You can't cite something, like you can't say you can't cite something late just because it's late. You can say it's being late is a problem that you have to overcome with arguments. That's fair. But there's several, actually 3 reasons why the Talmud is relevant. And it pertains to the method of triangulation, where you make the Talmud a part of an overarching collection of evidence that all triangulates to a single conclusion. The Talmud does not have to carry this argument by itself. But it is relevant, and you can use it that way. And a good example is Arian wrote his History of Alexander 500 years after Alexander, and yet historians agree Arian is one of the most reliable historians of Alexander because of the methods that Arian used and the way that he quoted things and other evidence and so forth. So just being late is not an argument against using the Talmud, just as it's not by itself an argument against relying on Arian. You need an argument. And so there's various things. So there are 3 things are, first of all, late evidence can be evidence of earlier traditions. One of the reasons this could be in the Talmud is that it is a very old tradition that has survived and finally got the first time that anything got written down that we have. Like, it probably got written down before, but we don't have any of those books. So you have to admit that it is possible that is an early tradition that is being preserved there. Now, you do need to have evidence for that and so on, and you can't just assert it, but you can't just assert the opposite either. The other thing that it can do is provide supporting evidence, meaning if you find early evidence for this, and it looks a lot like what shows up in the Talmud 500 years later, that is corroborating evidence. So you would not leave it out. It's actually definitely relevant. You do need to cite it because it is supporting the stuff that's showing up earlier. You can also use it to refute claims of impossibility because it shows a proof of concept. And this is the quote that I have at the top. This comes from the article that I wrote. That Talmudic compilers so easily developed a dying Messiah concept of their own, independently or not, demonstrates there was no Jewish hostility to the idea. Indeed, the Talmud evinces none at all, not even in any remembered discourse from the Tannaitic period. And if plausible for Talmudic Jews, so for pre-Christian Jews. So the argument here is it's a proof of concept. You can't say it's impossible if the Talmudic authors didn't think it was impossible. So here's a bunch of Jews who readily grabbed it. Even if that came late, it shows that it was very easy for Jews to grab onto. And the other thing that people who understand this point will try to move the goalposts and try to change it and say, well, okay, but the Talmud might just be reacting to borrowing ideas from Christianity. And the evidence suggests the opposite of that, actually. The Jews are less likely to borrow Christian heresies. It's more likely the Jews are reluctantly agreeing with the dying Messiah model against the fact that that's actually backing the heretical sect of Christians. They're very unlikely to just absorb it after the fact. And there's no evidence they did. And all the evidence points to it actually stemming from traditions that predate Christianity. That's what all these other scholars argue, is they accumulate evidence that triangulates to show that the Talmudic evidence looks like it is an evolution of a doctrine that predates Christianity. It does not look like some sort of borrowing or copying of Christianity, which wouldn't really make a lot of logical sense. The other thing I've heard thrown out there is that, well, maybe it's a reaction to the Bar Kokhba revolt because Bar Kokhba died. There's no evidence of that either. Also, it wouldn't make any sense again because Bar Kokhba in the Talmud is uniformly identified as a false or failed Messiah. So it's not like they used this tradition to sort of justify Bar Kokhba's death. They did the opposite. They just threw him out as a fake Messiah and never connect him to their messianic expectations of a dying Messiah. So there's no evident connection, and it seems unlikely that there would be a connection. So those are hypotheses for which there's no evidence. There's a little bit of evidence against, and therefore there's no reason to believe them. It's more likely the other way around. So you got to understand that's the relevance of the Talmud, is to do, and you do got to do all of this. You got to point out these things and so on. We're not ignoring these facts, but when they ignore the fact that we're not ignoring these facts, that is a thing you got to look at. Okay, scholars concurring. I'm not going to read all the names, but arguing the point is I've got a big list there. Concurring in opinion, I've got a list there. These are the authors I talk about and summarize and discuss in my article. Those are all the people who agree with me. And I'm going to pick an example, and I pick an example that's going to hurt certain people. George Brooke. So folks who know the backstory know why this is a painful one for certain parties to realize. George Brooke wrote 20 years ago all of this. So he's an example of someone who's kind of like a typical case. He agrees with thinking that 11Q13 implicates the dying Messiah of Daniel 9. So he's with me on that. And therefore, he argues Q13 should be viewed as providing much of the exegetical background, allowing for the early Christian development of the motif of a dying Messiah. That's almost verbatim element 5 in my book. So that it's basically exactly my thesis. George Brooke affirms my thesis. And I've won a piece of evidence too. So like I don't use only 11Q13, I stack the evidence. He adds a piece of evidence that I didn't and goes into detail on that because it's his area of expertise. In the use of Isaiah in 4Q541, which is a chapter in one of his books, he talks about the Apocryphon on Levi, which is it's actually, Brooke is a leading expert on that. Like, so he really studied the hell out of this. He's a leading Dead Sea Scrolls scholar. So he argues that it may be possible to construe 4Q541 as speaking of the death of an eschatological figure, as Isaiah 53 could itself be construed to do, possibly even a death by crucifixion. Again, that's almost verbatim what I argued in element 15, except without this evidence, so that he's actually stacking more evidence on top of the evidence that I had and coming to the same conclusion that I did. And so Brooke concludes, it now seems that there is a Jewish text whose author used the servant passages of Isaiah to support the understanding that there was to be an eschatological priest who would suffer, possibly even that the suffering involved death that would lead to joyous benefits for others. He talks about the atonement principle and everything being in there. And so the first Christians co-opted, not invented, quote unquote, already existing traditions about the suffering of the eschatological servant priest / Messiah to explain what happened to Jesus. And so this is exactly the thesis that I build in element 5. It is exactly what element 5 is doing. Even like the softer language, all of this is almost exactly my element 5. So this is Brooke is definitely supporting me here. He's a perfect example of this. Now, when I finished this study, I became even more convinced of the factual argument, not just the modal argument. And I think that when we look at all the evidence and all the arguments across all the studies by all the experts arguing this, as I did for this particular article, finally, I found dug through and found more and more people arguing it, more and more arguments, more and more evidence. So I went through all of it, and this is all in the article. I think even Brooks' cautious wording becomes over humble. I think the evidence is actually more overwhelming than he thought in 2005. And yet he still thinks it was convincing enough evidence, even with what he had then. And so that's why it's important here that's exactly what I argued. Everything that Brooke argues is what I argued. And my new study proves this is what almost every expert argues. So, like, remember, like I said, 45-2 at best for the opposition. So everybody's pretty much on my side on this. So that's the slideshow. We can take the slideshow off. And I don't know how you want to run from there, John, if you have particular questions you want to go into or take questions from the audience.
Yeah, we definitely want to take questions from the audience, and we do have somebody requesting up over there on the TikTok to ask you some questions. He's if it's the person that I think it is, pretty hostile. But before we get into that,
God, you're managing how many comments?
Everybody over there on 2 at least.
Okay, poor guy. All right.
But over there on over there on YouTube side, if you send in a super chat, we will definitely prioritize those. I do want to say thank you so much to Stop the Stupidity for becoming a member, as well as ALJ also becoming a member, and then McTime sent in some jewels in the form of a flower. That's a new thing for me over there on the YouTubes. But thank you so much there, McTime. And since McTime did send in something over there, they did have a question that they wanted to ask you first. Over there on TikTok, we are going to get you up here in just a second. But McTime asked, "What is the probability that Jesus existed?" And he was a charlatan faith healer, like all the other charlatan faith healers that are so fond of him. So, like, what's the likelihood of him just being some kind of charlatan, itinerant rabbi?
Yeah, I haven't really gamed out that very specific scenario. My conclusion, my latest conclusion in the obsolete paradigm, with updated evidence and so forth from the original study. My sequel study, which is 10 years later, so stuff happened in between. It actually updated some of my results. The final probability of a historical Jesus, I came to the top probability would be 1 in 4, so 25%. And I do think overwhelmingly that probability space is occupied by the apocalyptic prophet model. To what extent that involves, first of all, faith healing, that's a more open question. To what extent, and not necessary to whether Jesus existed, right? Like, it's not like if he wasn't a faith healer, he didn't exist. I mean, it's possible he existed and wasn't a faith healer, and that was a later tradition. But he might have been. That's totally plausible. But then going one step further and saying, well, like, he wasn't like someone who had convinced himself of this. He was an actual charlatan, right? And so that's a more complicated thesis, because you have to build out exactly why would he do the things he did specifically. I think that's less likely, not impossible, not implausible at all. I think it has a decent probability. I think it's less likely though, because when you go to my Wichita talk, which was that link I gave earlier that actually builds out my model of what I think is the most probable historical Jesus, it requires Jesus to actually have believed something about his literally trying to get himself killed. And there are several other of these guys who did the same thing. Josephus records them. He just doesn't literally call them a messiah, but he describes them doing messianic things. So he was a very coded way, like his Jewish readers would get what he's talking about. And they all do things that replicate Joshua. That's the word also. That's the same name of Jesus, right? So Josephus actually describes several Jesus Christs, like coded versions of Jesus Christ. He never describes Jesus that way. Even the Testimonium Flavianum does not construct Jesus that way, which is another one of many reasons we suspect that the testimonium is fake, that he never wrote it. If he had written about Jesus, he would have completely formulated him in the context of these other new Joshua pretender Messiah things. He would have written it that way, and that there's no structure at all in the TF that resembles that. But it shows like there's a trend of these guys are looking at the timetable in Daniel. They're looking at like the commentaries that we see, the kinds of commentaries we see at the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're thinking this is what has to happen in order to get Jeremiah's prophecy to work the way Daniel did, and therefore to get Daniel's prophecy to work, even though both Jeremiah and Daniel's prophecy both failed as written. Daniel is trying to fix the failure of Jeremiah. These messianic sects are trying to fix the failure of Daniel. And so the secret is that the belief is that the reason the end hasn't come, the reason why the clock has been delayed so long, the reason why the promises that it would come anytime now didn't happen, is that God is upset about the sins of Israel. The sins of Israel are upsetting him. He said, I'm not saving you because you're too big of sinners. And so they come up with this idea that what if a Messiah kills himself and his sacrifice atones for all of Israel? Then God's excuse goes away. And so now they've unlocked the apocalypse. God can bring the apocalypse and it'll happen. And that's almost explicitly what Daniel 9 says. Like, it's not as explicit as I just made it. But if you read the argument of Daniel 9, it's very much talking about to get this universal atonement, to get Jeremiah's prophecy to unlock, to get the apocalypse to happen, somebody's got to die. And it's got to be someone who's righteous and innocent, right? There's got to be a martyr. There's got to be this human sacrifice, essentially. Again, it doesn't put it in these terms, but you read it, you can kind of you can read it between the lines. So this is what they're talking about. And so you see a lot of these guys doing this. They're doing actions that are intended to get themselves killed because they believe that will unlock the apocalypse. And of course, that means that they think they'll be resurrected in the apocalypse, just like everybody, because they have to actually believe this. You can't be a charlatan and go get yourself killed thinking that's going to unlock the apocalypse, because that being a charlatan means you don't think that, right? So if you do think that, you're not a charlatan. And it is possible to be both. Like, you can be someone who genuinely believes all these things, but thinks that you have to do charlatan-y things to get them to happen. That's also possible. There's liars for Jesus. We know that is a trend that still exists today. So a combination model is possible. But I can't think you can run with a straight charlatan model. I don't think it fits entirely. You can make it fit with some adjustment of how the legends arose and things like that. And so it's not impossible. I don't think it's implausible. It's just not the one that I think is most probable. The most probable is the one I talk about in that lecture.
We have another question that maybe you can answer real quick from the TikTok side, and that's, what are your thoughts on inspiring philosophy, Dr. Carrier?
Well, you can just go to my blog and check that out. Okay. That's too vague a question, but generally, I wrote an article on because I went and did that debate at the Christian Nationalist Conference where IP was there and Doug Wilson, and I debated both of them. My debate with Inspiring Philosophy was better. Like, it was more like a serious debate than like the Doug Wilson debate was just a shit show and just clownery. Like, he wasn't taking the debate seriously at all. So that was just a waste of time. Inspiring Philosophy actually did try to argue his position and actually tried to engage my arguments and things like that. So I did a really good analysis interview with Wondering Sapiens. So go on YouTube, find Wondering Sapiens, his channel. He does these really great breakdowns where we go through our arguments and I talk about the theory of debate and, like, structurally, strategically, what's happening right now in the debate and in our exchanges. So that you can see what I think about Inspiring Philosophy in terms of where he's at and why he's like that. But I do write about it a little bit on my blog in terms of where I'm losing faith in debate as a useful method of doing anything. But you can read about that on my blog. It's kind of a distraction here.
Okay. So we do have somebody that's itching to get up over here on the TikTok side, that wants to address you now. Just I may have to try to mute rigorously here if it gets too out of hand. But there is a small delay going from me to Carrier, so you got to keep
Yeah.
that in mind over there on the TikTok side. So just be sure to keep that in mind. So we're gonna get Sufi Yahoo up. Maybe. Nope, they did not join. I don't know what happened to them. I know that
Oh,
they were, yeah, they were muted in chat, but I thought that maybe they could still get up. But if you are
is
in the chat over there on the TikTok side, please feel free to request up. Oh, go ahead.
did they type anything? Can we at least like respond to something they wrote, or or
Well, I
or is
mean,
there anything worth the
it's
bother?
pretty much just them being not not really like the like they were calling us two pagan uneducated Jesus haters who are
Oh, okay.
orthodoxy and do not understand
See, this
Jesus
is
at
what I
all.
mean. That's
Yeah,
completely
it
completely
sounds,
clown show, unserious.
yeah,
Like,
it kind of sounds,
take you seriously if that's your attitude. Like that's just
yeah.
dumb. It's like, what are you, 14? And that's an insult to
Well, it
14 year
kind of sounds
olds.
like yeah, exactly. My son acts better than that.
Yeah, no,
And
most
he's
14-year olds
16.
act better than that.
But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. He sounded, they sounded like a Hebrew Israelite. I know that you've had some debates with them
Oh,
in the
okay.
past, like
Yeah,
forums.
yeah. Yeah.
You, they were giving off those kind of vibes. Although there is redheaded trouble over on TikTok that asks, "What's your take on the Zealots, Essenes, and Zoroastrianism's influence on Christian eschatology?"
Zealots, Essenes, and Zoroastrians. That's a wide range of different things. I First of all, I don't think zealotry was actually a sect. When Josephus frames them as a sect, I think that's kind of a little bit of political propaganda. So I'm not really sure about that. Like, it's really trying to attach that some sort of unified eschatological ideas of the zealots. The only thing we know about the zealots for sure is that they believed in military rebellion against Rome, like basically freedom for Israel. What they believed beyond that, like, I don't know if you can trust Josephus on that. The Essenes, clearly a lot of connections because there's a lot of similarity between early Christianity and Essenism. There's a lot of similarity between Essenism and the Dead Sea Scrolls and Christianity. So this is kind of triangle of things. We also know from Hippolytus that there were actually at least 9 subsects of Essenes, and that the Essenes actually descend from Samaritans. So they actually have some sort of ideological connection with the Samaritan movement, which is interesting in a lot of ways because that was more connected to the prior to the sort of Israelite Judaism of the intertestamental period. So they kind of like developed separately during the exile. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff about that, which I'm not an expert in. I haven't deep dived it, so I can't go into details on that. That's the fact of what the sources are saying. Um, the eschatology, we know very little, except that if we look at Dead Sea Scrolls are really the only clearly case where we have a group that had a set of eschatological views and said enough things that we can say some things about them. Unfortunately, the things they said were in completely torn up scrolls with holes in them and things like that. So like we don't get complete pictures of them, and there's a lot of literature trying to figure out what they believed based on the shreds we have. But a lot of the scholars that I discuss in this article are talking about that specifically, is how much of Dead Sea eschatology ends up in Christianity, and what pieces and in what way. That in itself wouldn't mean that the Christians came from the Dead Sea Scroll community. It just means they came from a similar minded zeitgeist or group, right? There might have been a lot of these groups all over the place. Qumran is just one of them. So Christianity didn't necessarily come from Qumran, but there's clearly overlap in terms of the sects that they come from. And yes, this all is a part of a form of Judaism. The Pharisees too. There's all form of Judaism that is heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism, but that influence is way downstream, right? So like, it's not like the Christians are reading Zoroastrian books and getting ideas. That's not what happened. What happened is, like, hundreds of years before, Zoroastrian ideas bled into Judaism, creating the whole sort of apocalyptic messianic concept of Judaism. The whole idea of all resurrection cults in Judaism harken back to the influence, because the idea of general resurrection and apocalypse and linear time and all that all comes from Zoroastrianism. Persian comes from Iran, essentially. It's a timely note for all of us. But That's where it comes from. But it entered into Judaism hundreds of years before. By the time Christians come around, they might not have had any knowledge of that influence, or that's what was going on. Like, because they're just dealing with their inherited fringe sects and even mainstream sectarian views of Judaism. They're not, in their mind, they're not reacting to Zoroastrianism. It's just Judaism. So like that's a thing that in hindsight, us can look at the evidence and say, oh, look, Zoroastrianism is sitting way in the deep background of this. Anyway, that's the best answer I can give you. I don't know, because your question was a little vague. So like that's the most I can do with that. Does it relate to the article that I'm writing? Not so far as we know, because there's not really like a dying Messiah. We can't reconstruct a dying Messiah model from Zoroastrianism, right? So that didn't inherit. I think that's a later development. In fact, I think it was caused by Daniel 9. So Daniel was written in the 160s BC, and it was written to respond to a very specific political circumstance. It was a forgery. It was pretending to be a prophecy written hundreds of years before, but it wasn't. It was very much war propaganda. It was designed to get people riled up and think that they could defeat their at that time, Greek conquerors, and they did. And so it was based on a different set of circumstances. The dying Messiah in that model is Onias III, an actual high priest who was killed. And so it's actually based on his death, painting him as the Messiah who will unlock the apocalypse and begin the final 7 years or whatever of the timeline. And so that was what the original authors were doing, but it didn't happen, right? Like everything after they wrote, everything after they published did not go the way that they predicted, and the apocalypse obviously didn't occur. So by the time you get to the Dead Sea Scrolls that are about this, like 11Q13 and stuff, they're reacting to a world in which Daniel's prophecy failed, but they do not believe Daniel was a false prophet. Therefore, they're reinterpreting Daniel to try and predict, well, who is this Messiah who's going to unlock the apocalypse? When is he going to come? And so they came up with all of these sort of like wackadoo scriptural interpretations inspired by the Holy Spirit kind of stuff. And that kind of thinking fed into Christianity. So Christians are kind of very much in that tradition, and it makes complete sense in that context of what they're doing. They're just doing the same thing. The only kind of innovation that they come up with is that they decide that it has happened. Rather than talking about some future thing that's going to happen anytime now, they said, no, our guy died. Apocalypse is happening. 7 years, the clock has begun. It's going to end. But, we know that it didn't. So they had to keep reinterpreting even their own failed prophecies to sort of keep the ball and the can kicked down the road and so forth. But that's kind of, if you want to see how I build that out for a historical Jesus, that's again the Wichita talk. You're all going to die that you can find that I did for Harold Camping's Rapture Day, when he said the world was going to end today. That was a long time ago, 2015, I think. I did that talk then to talk about the end of the world. The world didn't end. As FYI, we're still here. But anyway, that was another example of predicting the end of the world and it failing. And so you have to reinterpret, make it not have failed somehow. And so Christianity, the subtitle of my talk is that how the Jews kept failing to predict the apocalypse and accidentally caused Christianity. That's the subtitle of it. And so that's the best I can do as far as answering your question there. And I think if you deep dive those other subjects, if you want to get more.
Yeah, so Redheaded Trouble did request up. She's the one that asked, and so she should be over there. Redheaded, can you say something to make sure that we're
Yeah,
moving
of
over?
course. Hi, Rick. Hi, Dr. Carrier. How are you?
Hi. Doing well.
Can
I'm
you hear me?
having
Or can you hear me? Okay, cool.
yeah. We have there's a delay. Just be aware that it's like we're in space and talking to mission control, but just
There's
FYI.
a little bit of delay. Okay, gotcha. So I had limited characters in the comment section to work with, so I kind of try to encapsulate as much into my question but I definitely see there's like a thread between like Zoroastrianism and just Jewish thought going into the first century. And I feel like that pours over, it's kind of like I kind of see it like kind of like an avalanche. It's kind of like at the end, like Zoroastrianism gets infused into Christianity. Like over time?
Okay, yeah, I would say it actually got infused in Judaism over time, and then Christianity evolved out of that mutated Judaism. So all of the Zoroastrian input already happened. Now, there are people who try to argue about later Zoroastrian influence when you get to like Manichaeism and things like that later, like centuries later. That is something I know less about because I haven't studied Manichaeism. I haven't studied late antique sectarianism to like get into that further. So I'm not the expert to ask about that. Like, to what extent did Zoroastrianism continue to affect Christianity that it hadn't already done through its infection onto Judaism? All I know is that everything that shows up in the 1st and 2nd century in Christianity was already in Judaism. And got there from the Jewish exile in Persia or in the Persian Empire.
I'm so sorry, my internet right now is.
I think I don't even know if Dr. Carrier is even there still. Can you hear me?
Oh
wait,
shit!
There we go. We're back.
Wait, did you lose my audio? Did I go away?
Yeah, for a little bit, we did.
I didn't see that.
You
on
did
my
for a
end.
second. Sorry. It was no, yeah, it's definitely on my end that happened.
Okay.
So you were talking about how it was worked into Judaism, Zoroastrianism was, and I think we kind of got there, and then everything kind of went haywire.
Yeah. So you didn't hear?
Just for clarification, like it got kind of this infusion happened at around like 300, 400 BCE, like around the Maccabean era,
or earlier, but yeah. Definitely an intertestamental period. So sometime between the beginning of the exile and the return, right? So like, what is the timeline on that? So possibly even later, like after the Second Temple was built, the influence could have come after that too, and it might have been over time, right? Like so. Those are bigger questions in terms of the deep history of Judaism, hundreds of years before Christianity. In terms of the audio that got disappeared, that should show up in the archived version of this, because my end is being recorded and will be sent to John when we close out this tonight. And so in the archived version, that will all come back. And in theory, it might even be a better video quality. In theory, I don't know. I'd have to see it. I have to come back and see. But anyway, the point being is that audio is not lost. It's just temporarily sitting in a buffer somewhere until the archive version goes out.
Would you also say that Hellenistic influences, like just from like Greek mythology, kind of like mixed in with that as well?
So I would say the philosophy side, a lot of the Hellenistic metaphysics that shows up in like Paul, for instance, that comes from Judaism, because Hellenism already infected Judaism. And we see that in Philo of Alexandria, for example. However, Christianity continued absorbing more. So when you get to like the Gospels and stuff, they're actively looking for what are the scriptures of pagans that we can co-opt and rewrite to make our Jesus guy better than their guy, and sort of trump their scriptures. And so a lot more pagan ideas, especially literary ideas, enter into the narrative culture of Christianity and show up there. So I think that effect was continual. And by the time you get to the 3rd century, you see more and more looting of Neoplatonism into Christianity and things like that. So that's definitely true. And we have an example. One I talk about in my book, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. I think it's in that one, right? Yeah, it might be in Science Education. I'm pretty sure it's in Scientist. But I talk about Christianity rejecting. So like what became mainstream Christianity, the sort of imperial Constantinian Christianity, rejected certain sects. And the sort of opposition was already setting up in the 3rd century. But we have references to a 2nd century Christian sect who was so obsessed with the writings of Aristotle. I guess it was like late 2nd or early 3rd century. They were so obsessed with the writings of Aristotle and Galen that this was considered by Origen and others as being going too far, right? Like you're absorbing too much evil Greek culture. You can't have that. But we learned nothing else about them because they were kind of shunned and their writings were not preserved. So we only know about references to how awful they were, but they existed. But that shows us that they were readily adopting like even recent new pagan theory and ideas into their religion. So it was definitely being affected by Hellenism way more than Zoroastrianism in the first like 3 or 4 centuries. And there was even hostility to that, but even the ones who are hostile are doing the same things. They're just picking different philosophers to steal stuff from, and calling it, finding it in scripture rather than like what it really is. So yeah, that's a complex story. Again, doesn't really relate to today's topic. Sorry.
Yeah, I believe it's what Ezekiel 37 is where we start seeing Zoroastrian influence. If I'm not, I know it's somewhere in Ezekiel that it starts popping up.
Certainly. I don't know the answer to the where does it show up first question. I think that's still debated actually. But that's not my area. I haven't studied that. So
Yeah. All right. Well, Redheaded Trouble. Thank you so much for coming up
Awesome.
and
Thanks.
asking a question.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay.
cool.
I was gonna ask if you had any more questions to ask for Carrier, but if
I
if not,
mean, I could obviously talk to Dr. Carrier for hours and hours about all kinds of topics regarding history and stuff, but I don't want to monopolize your life.
all right. Well, I really appreciate you coming up and everything, Redheaded Trouble. And I've started doing co-hosting things on my own channel here, and I've seen that you've started doing your conversations and everything again. So I'd love to have
You
you up
know,
sometime.
I am writing my own book right now, and that's kind of been monopolizing most of my TikTok time because I still have to bartend and drive for Lyft and try to survive
Right.
in Las
Yeah.
Vegas. So
Oh wow.
Oof. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you're ever interested in doing a co-hosting thing, just let me know, okay?
awesome. Thanks, John. I appreciate you.
Yep. Appreciate you too. See you, Redheaded. We do have a couple of super chats there, Carrier.
Cool.
So first up is Jason Rollins, who says, "Do you not include two Esdras in this analysis? Do you just think it? Do you just think it's too late?"
That is a really great question. So let me see if I can find. I can't find it. I'm pretty sure that was in there. Maybe I have it spelled differently. Oh no. Doggone it. I'm pretty sure there's a footnote in my article on it. I'm not finding it. Where I mention a couple things. There are a few of those documents that I put them in a footnote where I say like I'm not going to talk about these because it's too disputed as to how much Christians have meddled with the text. So there are scholars who think they haven't. There are scholars who think they have. There are scholars who dispute which things are meddled by Christians and so on. So it's such a mucked up case that I don't think there's anything we can do with those. I mean, they're interesting and it's worth looking at it. There are these dying Messiah traditions that show up in some documents like that, but it just becomes a sort of horrible maze to try and figure out like how much of this is really coming from Christians and how much are the ones that I cite. 2 Ezra. I don't know if are you sure there's a 2 Ezra reference to a dying Messiah? I'm pretty sure that's 4 Ezra, but it's in there. So is this a question of did that come from Christians or not? Since we can't resolve that question, I just footnote it and don't include it in my study, basically. And that's kind of the attitude that I got from all the scholars that I looked at. I didn't find any scholar who was really confident that they could use these to argue this point. So so that just kind of corroborates my intuition about it as well. So that's why we didn't use them.
Let's see, and then we've got Foo Rocker who asks, "Really want to see the great Richard Carrier and Richard C. Miller have a long conversation together." Earlier this year I was supposed to have Miller on my channel, and so it'd be interesting to get both of you guys on a live together.
Yeah, I was so gratified by his dissertation when it came out. I was like, yes. Yeah, he did masterful work. Like I just skimmed the surface of what he did. Or I was already seeing the things that he was seeing, but I only had a few examples, and he just fucking deep dive that. And I was like, yeah, okay, that's what I want. I want people carrying that much water and doing that. No, he's done some really good work, and I've noticed like he's made some really interesting Facebook posts. Like he occasionally like throws out his thoughts. In reality, of course, like he's making real money doing like a real job or whatever. But that's why he's kind of not producing scholarship. Is that he can make more money outside academia, and that's just true for most academics, right? But no, he did some really great scholarship, important scholarship. I cite it in Obsolete Paradigm, my new book, and so and he has some really good insights, and it's funny because we had like some really serious arguments between each other in the past, but they're mostly over like technical, philosophical, meta stuff, and we've gone past that now. But no, I think he has a lot to contribute, and it would be worthwhile to have that conversation because he can't be punished by the community, right? So like the academic community can't get him fired. They can't get his office taken away and pushed into a corner. They can't bury him in committees. They can't like deny his grants. Like there's no way they can affect him. So he's actually free to actually talk how he wants to do. And I think that's real academic freedom, right? And so for someone who's completed a PhD in the field and has actually done really good literary mimesis work and so on. So yeah, I think that would be a fun thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. And I had a private conversation with him that was great. And you know, we really connected on a lot of things. And while he maybe didn't necessarily agree with you know, all of my positions on things, you know, he was very amenable, you know, you know, the more critical position of Jesus's historicity. And I definitely want to get him on a show to talk about his view of the Gospels being was it translocation stories or something like that. Like it's a
Translation,
kind of interesting take
yeah.
that he has on that.
Yeah, well,
Translation,
it's
that's right,
yeah,
translation.
it's what he's describing is a broader genre, right? So like empty tombs, ascension narratives, disappearing people that got ascended to heaven, right? So there's a whole genre that when you realize that this is a genre and it just has instantiations, then you start to see things that you might have missed otherwise. If you're very narrowly looking for, I need exactly the same story somewhere, you're going to miss the fact that actually this is a trope that can get realized in many different ways, and that's really crucial. One of the examples that I've used on an unrelated issue is what I call sort of the John Wick hero narrative, where and I even define it with criteria and I talk about this in Obsolete Paradigm. So people who want to see this, go there for that, get that book, and I talk about this, where you have the sort of righteous mass shooter, essentially, or mass killer. You can include swordsman in this. The righteous mass killer is and it has a story arc. It has a lot of similarities, a lot of little tropey pieces that kind of defines the genre. And when you see the tropes and how they can be instantiated in different ways, so like it doesn't matter whether it's a gun or a sword. It doesn't matter whether the fridged loved one or the kidnapped loved one is a dog or a person, right? Like so then you start to realize that this is a whole big genre that there are a lot of these different instantiations of happening. And then you start to understand like what is the appeal of this sort of narrative? Why does it get rewritten in all these different ways that you wouldn't notice otherwise, right? And so I think like that's important. That's what Miller is doing with the translation narrative. Like they're all narratives about being translated into divine status in outer space, essentially. And so how that happens can be realized and imagined in many different ways. But there's a lot of these tropes that pile up that are very common to all these stories. And it's what's called a homeostatic cluster. He doesn't use that word, but this is a term of art in philosophy and science, which is that to be a part of this genre, you don't have to share exactly the same criteria. You just have to have enough overlapping criteria with the genre to be in it. So, you know, it's like it's usually a percentage. Like if you hit X number of points, you're in it, and it's very obvious that you're in it, and this is not an accident. It's not a coincidence. And then people will deliberately drop certain elements. It doesn't matter which elements they drop, as long as they don't drop too many. And so you can create all these different versions of the story. And so that's what he's getting at, is this translation narrative has many different instantiations, but there's this homeostatic cluster of ideas that really overlaps with all of them. And Christianity's gospel story is absolutely in the genre. There's no dispute about it. And that's the kind of thinking that you really do have to like do the work to find. And I think like apologists don't want to admit is real, right? Like they want to come up with excuses to make that go away, essentially. And I've dealt with that in the historicity debate with the rank raglan thing. It's the exact same kind of scenario. I talk, and that's in fact where I come up with the John Wick analogy is what I use to explain the rank raglan hero analogy. It's the same kind of thing. It's the same kind of micro genre. So Obsolete Paradigm is the book for that. If you want to catch up and get interesting things in that. And I cite Miller on that in there.
Yeah, and we actually do have one super chat that's directly on the topic of the live stream tonight. And that's Jason Rollins over there on YouTube. Yeah. Asks, what do you think the best evidence we have that Jews generally rejected the dying Messiah idea? It seems to me that we rely heavily on Paul. Is there anything else to go off of?
No. So the theory, remember, it's a theory that for my slideshow, it's just a theory. But it's based on the fact that most of the, so first you've got to realize we've lost 99% of everything that was written, right? So there's tons of Jewish views that we don't have because they're gone. We know there was like something like 30 different sects of Judaism. We know next to nothing about almost all of them, right? So there's so much we don't know. And that's one of the main problems. But what has survived leans towards the idea of the militarily triumphant Messiah, which is actually more of a Sadducee idea. The idea that the Messiah would defeat Rome or whoever and basically make Israel invincible and independent, and everyone in the world would bow down to Israel. This is literally like in the early prophets. And so the idea of the military, because there's so much reference and discussion of the military successful Messiah, the theory arose that, well, that's all Jews understood and expected, right? Even though that's not really a logically valid inference, right? So that's a fallacy, right? It's just saying that there were Jews, therefore, and whose writings and ideas preserved to us, who did expect that, like they expected Bar Kokhba to actually fucking win, right? And so there definitely absolutely were factions who believed that. It might have probably have been the majority view insofar as even Messianism, because this is another thing, is like there's the assumption that Pharisees defined everything that Jews were, but there might have been tons of Jews, maybe for as far as we know, a majority of Jews who did not even believe in a Messiah, right? The idea of like Messianism is not necessarily the fixed universal view of Judaism. It may have been very widespread. It may have been the majority view, but we have no way of knowing this. It can only just be sort of inferred or assumed or speculated. But the point being is that we have all of this evidence for the military victorious Messiah. And so the inference is that therefore that's what all Jews expected. That's a false inference, but it is the inference being made. We don't have any like text that says the Messiah absolutely will like, how do I even put this? Well, absolutely like will rise up, defeat the enemies, and there'll be nothing ever bad will happen to that Messiah. He will only succeed. He'll only be awesome. And nothing, you'll never have a failure and whatever. Like we have no text saying that, right? And this one thing is important to note, that like even Christianity is a victorious military Messiah cult. They just think that Jesus is going to come back with an army of angels and then win, which is an idea we do find in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that Melchizedek is going to be this guy who's going to rise up, come down from heaven with an army of angels and defeat all the evil or whatever and bring about the end of the world. And so, which is really basically what Christians are doing. And we even know from Hebrews that Christians thought there was some connection between Melchizedek and Jesus. Where do you think that comes from, right? Like we have that in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is the guy who's going to come from heaven with an army of angels and end the world, right? And defeat everybody, defeat all the villains and so forth. Christianity is still a triumphal military Messiah cult. It just has this interruption where he has to die, has to sacrifice himself, and then come back and then get military victory. When you phrase it like that, which is totally correct, that's what the Christians believed from day one, then it's harder to find contrary examples, right? So like the dying doesn't really matter. So you get like the Bar Kokhba thing where he died, but there he literally promised that he would be victorious then. He didn't go around saying, you know what, I'm going to get killed and then I'll come back with angels. That's not what he said. He said, I'm going to win now. And then he died. And well, I guess you were a liar. Like that was the end of Bar Kokhba, right? So the thing is that that's why I suspect that Jesus, if he was a historical person, did not go around saying, I'm going to raise an army and defeat Rome. If he had said that and then died, everybody would just walked away. I think he's pulling the Daniel 9 story. He's trying to get himself killed, and he's telling people, and then that will unlock the apocalypse. Just wait until I die. That'll be the thing. I'll atone for all sins. That's how righteous and good I am. My death will atone for all the sins of Israel and unlock the apocalypse. You just wait and see. That's why I think that is a very plausible model of a historical Jesus. It just so happens that you don't need a historical Jesus for that to also work. You can have a space Jesus do exactly the same thing, just like Osiris cult did. And so that then gets into the whole question of like, what evidence do we have for what kind of Jesus was, right? But in terms of like, why do why does the dogma exist, right? Like, why do they think Jews could only conceive of a military victorious Messiah who never gets humiliated, never suffers or anything like that? Why do they think that? And really the only like empirical reason, like the only like reason that would like not be like emotional and stupid would be this idea that this is all we find. The problem is that isn't true. Like the Talmud doesn't even really have that, because it has the dying Messiah followed by the victorious space Messiah. And so, which is Christianity, right? So like the thing that they theorize doesn't actually have a text saying that thing. That's the problem with it. Is that actually, you know, like you should just dump the dogma. It's actually just a bad hypothesis, but it is reasonable to suspect, and we know from like the Bar Kokhba example, that there were Jews who expected this. They expected a militarily victorious Messiah, not a guy who dies and comes back from outer space later. So there were Jews who thought that. The problem is, like, did all Jews think that? And the evidence is no. And that's what all these 30 scholars and these 30 studies and 40 plus scholars agreed, like that was not the universal view. And so when you are willing to admit that, that's where you get to the position that I was in Element 5 in 2014 and on the Historicity of Jesus, which is actually the mainstream consensus view. Like if you look at the actual experts who've actually studied this specific question, the overwhelming number of studies come to my conclusions, not to the opposition. And so that's why I come out where I come out, and why I come out even stronger now than I was back then. Back then, I was all about the disjunct. It could be one or the other. I was like, you know, maybe slightly more probable than not. No, now I'm really confident. When I look at like all these 30 studies, I'm like, oh, wow, the evidence is freaking overwhelming. I think is absolutely you should come to that conclusion. But again, that requires you to like look at the evidence, look at the arguments and all of that stuff. Now, there's a bigger question as to why is there this fierce resistance to admitting an obvious thing? Like, why is it the fact that the overwhelming consensus of the field is actually, for me, like on my side on this, but everybody keeps saying that it's the other way around? That my view is fringe, is incompetent, is completely misreading the evidence. Why does that? Why is there a resistance to that? Why won't people look at the evidence? Why won't people address the actual logic? Why won't people look at the literature? Like what is the obsession with this idea that no, Christians had to have come up with this by themselves? And I've been stewing over this thinking, and I have a lot of thoughts about it. I don't think there's a single reason. I think there's different baskets of people have different motives for this. And it goes back to the 50s and 60s when Christian apologetics and Christian biblical studies was a lot more anti-Semitic than it is now. And I do say relatively, because you can still say I've been working on this project about anti-Semitism in Christianity, and one of the studies that I look at, and I think it's from the 80s. I can't remember the exact date of it, but it might be later, which would be more embarrassing. But where it's about how Christianity is not anti-Semitic, and it's a bunch of Christian apologists saying this. But in the process of the book, they like literally have arguments like the Jews are at fault, like the Jews are responsible for anti-Semitism. They caused it. They deserve it. It's all their fault. And I'm like, in their effort to argue that Christianity is not anti-Semitic, I'm like, you guys are a bunch of anti-Semites pretending not to be anti-Semites. This is brilliant. So you have that sort of like it's dog whistle stuff rather than like outright fuck the Jews kind of. They like it's not like Nazi Hitler stuff. No, it's kind of like, no, the Jews are great and wonderful. They're just stubborn and could never think of this. They're not creative. And you needed like the Christians to break free of like the sort of awful stuck conservative Judaism, like because the Jews could never do this. And so like you had to have these special people, and you had to like have God send a guy to come down and like explain this because the Jews are so stubborn and would never believe it. And so you had to have like the God had to send himself. He had to come down, but he only talked to a few Jews, and then they like said, no, Judaism is stupid. And then Christianity becomes the thing and conquers the world and explains antibiotics or whatever, like whatever the stupid story is. It is actually fundamentally anti-Semitic, even though it's not literally framed that way. But it is. And so I think there is this idea that Christianity has to be special. Christianity can't just be a natural anthropological evolution of Judaism, right? Like it can't be, because if that's the case, then it can't be true. It's just another stupid religion that just evolved over time like every other religion. But for Christianity to be true, and for Christianity to be the savior of the Western world and all of this stuff, it has to be special and great. There has to have done something special. And so this idea that no, the Christians are the one who saw this. The Christians alone came up with the dying Messiah model. The Jews could never see it. They could never think of it. It would be blasphemy. They were mind blocked. They could never do this. And that's actually a little bit anti-Semitic, right? There's some sort of subliminal anti-Semitism in there. And I think that's what created it in the 50s and 60s, right? And so then it became what everybody was told. This is what everybody told me, right? Like this is what I was told in college. This is what I was told in seminary. Everybody said this, including prestigious people. They can't be wrong, right? These prestigious, like big scholars with big careers, they told me this. And so they just keep repeating it as the thing they were told. And so if you come along, and now we've had like in the late 90s and early 2000s, we had this big reconciliation, this big sort of like shift in biblical studies. We're like, hey, we've been kind of anti-Semitic for a while. Maybe we should just admit Jesus was a Jew. And if we want to understand early Christianity, we have to put him back in his Jewish context and understand what he was saying and doing as a Jew. It would make sense in its Jewish context. And that's become kind of the mainstream now. People forget that that's a new thing, that this admission that Jesus was Jewish was like this big scandalous thing that like transformed the field and created a new quest for the historical Jesus. Before that, it was not the trend, right? It was the opposite trend. So the sort of lore, the sort of mythology of the dying Messiah, can't have thought of a dying Messiah, that originated in the anti-Semitic era. And then this new sort of enlightened Jesus was a Jew version of biblical studies came along, and then people forgot where the stuff they were told came from, right? And so they never stopped to think, maybe all the shit I was told is false. Maybe I need to rethink this. And I think that's why this trope keeps getting recycled. There's another reason, especially why it gets recycled among Christian apologists specifically. And this is the thing that I encountered as an atheist, as an expert on resurrection apologetics, because that's how I got my chops, right? In the late 90s and early 2000s I was the guy who read all the books and knows all the anti-resurrection apologetics, knows all the resurrection apologetics, knows all that. And I've debated William Lane Craig twice on this and so on. At that time, throughout all of that, a common argument was that so Jesus must have actually risen from the dead, because Jews would never believe that he was the Messiah if he died, right? So he's a failed Messiah, so he must have actually appeared to them. And therefore, this became an argument for the resurrection. Now, if that's what's convinced you, or if that's a thing you think is a correct argument, well, now you're emotionally invested in the dogma, right? Now you have to believe that the Jews never had this before. Because otherwise, if you admit that this was a thing already, Well, now that argument goes out the door, right? And so you kick the legs out from under it. And that's scary to Christian apologists, right? Like they don't like the idea that they were wrong about something and that their confidence was based on a thing that was wildly false. And they certainly don't like being told that it was anti-Semitic to begin with. And so you get this very emotional cognitive dissonance reason to be against what I'm arguing and what 30 other scholars have argued and what the vast majority have actually argued. And so there's a huge attraction to maintaining the dogma against what we're talking about. And so that comes mostly from the Christian apologetic side. Why secular historians do it, I think, has a lot more to do with like self-identity and pride and not being willing to admit that they were wrong about something, not being willing to admit that people they revered were wrong about something. Although in the case that we're talking about now, like George, like the fact that Brooke is entirely on my side should be sufficient to change minds based on prestige arguments. But that's why I think certain particular people involved in this have their own personal ego, that they can't admit that they're wrong. So therefore they have to come up with any excuse possible to make me wrong, because otherwise it would be so devastating to their self-image to admit that they fucked up, that they just can't. They're basically just, they've dug the hole, and so now they're just defending the hole. There's nothing else they can do. And I think that's a personal ego thing, that's not an ideological, like, broad thing. I think most people have other reasons for being for the dogma. But there are a few people, I think Bart Ehrman is like this too. Like, he's super hostile to it ever admitting he's wrong, and this traps him in like false views a lot. And he, a good example of this is the idea that Jesus was divine, right? So he ragged on me. How dare you suggest that the first Christians thought Jesus was divine? I explicitly said he wasn't God, not identical to God, but he was a divine figure that came from heaven and so forth. That's mainstream now, right? Like there's like a huge number of studies confirming early high Christology. That is the mainstream consensus now. But Ehrman like slagged me off on this, claiming I didn't know what I was talking about. And then until he read a scholar who had sufficient social status, right? They had enough prestige that he couldn't say that about them anymore. And then that they convinced him, right? And so that and so now he comes out with How Did Jesus Become God, where he's making my argument. Never apologizes to me for saying, like, slagging me off for making that argument. No, he's making the argument. I just, I don't know, I was convinced by this thing, but he completely blanks on the fact that he was like completely slagging me off for taking that position before he did. That's an example of like personal ego getting in the way of like admitting things, where he only responds to prestige, not to evidence. And I think that also happens in this subject, where people only respond to prestige, not to evidence. And that's why it's important psychologically. It's not important evidentially or like logically, but it's important psychologically to point this out with this study where I now have. Look, all these prestigious scholars, a lot of really prestigious scholars are taking my position. Now will you agree? How many studies do you need? Right? Like 30? We got 30. Do we need 100? Like when do you need like enough peer-reviewed studies confirming what I'm saying before you would believe it? Like, that's where you have to start asking. Like, really, a handful should be enough. So the fact that you waited for 30 is already showing that you have a huge emotional investment in my being wrong. You don't actually have like a logical or valid empirical reason to take that position. And if you're not even convinced by 30 studies, you're emotionally gone. Like, your cognitive dissonance has completely destroyed your critical thinking. And I can't save you. Like, you're just lost at that point. But that's why this article was needed, and that was the reason why I published it. And I even say that in the article, like, that this is needed. Like, there's too much dogma going around that we've got to dispel this, and we got to stop, reset, get our baseline back, and then start building on what the actual consensus is. Sorry, that was a long rant about this, but that's what I was saying. And that's the stuff I didn't put in the article. My
you're good. You're good. I feel like, right. No, I think everybody would much rather hear from you tonight than me. But I do have somebody that requested up in the TikTok live first, and then there's somebody over on Video Ninja. I do want to get to both of them. So first up is MD Smith.
Oh, no.
Hey there. Is it Mike?
Oh, yes. Mike?
Yeah.
Sorry, it is Mike. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Listen, I went to high school with 4 other Mike Smiths, so MD it is.
Okay.
All
Um,
right.
Wait,
so
What question
I
did you have for Carrier?
so I have to admit I feel really stupid because I forgot to make the list of 900 things I would ask if I had the opportunity to speak with you. I didn't conceive of it. So the best I could come up with was a question regarding something. Something I heard, I believe, and I'll tell you just really quickly right off the bat. I was born, raised, and educated Roman Catholic. Went to a boys' Catholic high school. I stopped identifying as Catholic at the age of 17, and I started doing this kind of thing, my own, deconstruction channel recently. But I've been studying it heavily as a layman in the past 4 or 5 years, and you're one of the primary people who has informed my positions on the historicity of the Bible and Jesus, and so I feel privileged to speak with you. So the best question I could come up with, without any notice, is talking about what do you think the role was of, and I think it was you that I heard say this. Christianity was the first or one of the first religions with an exclusivity sort of clause to it. If you became a Christian, if you converted, to only be a Christian. Is that correct?
Uh, it's the first one to like win over the West, right? So like technically Zoroastrianism is like that, and obviously Judaism is like that. But Judaism was never successful politically, right? Like they didn't conquer the world. The Persian Empire did briefly, but that didn't last very long. But really Christianity is the first one to explode, seize an empire, like it becomes the Constantinian imperial religion at just the right moment, that it kind of like got economic lock-in, and so it defined the West ever since. And then the West had a bunch of other reasons why it would dominate the world, but because basically Christianity is just riding on that. And
Right.
you can think of it like Islam is really a sect of Christianity. There are scholars who actually argue this literally, and it's like it looks like it descends from the original Jewish Christianity, because the kosher and halal are very similar. They look like halal looks like an evolution of kosher thought and so on. And so it's like really Islam is also descended in one way or another from Judaism, whether through Christianity or not. Christianity descends from that, but they're evangelistic, militaristic, that ends up being crucial, and exclusivistic, right? And so that's the point you're referring to. I'm actually going to write a blog soon about this, because I'm pulling this material out of Sense and Goodness Without God. I'm going to put it on my blog because I don't want it clouding my new volume. This the replacement for Sense and Goodness that's going to come out end of this year or early next. About this idea that it was the sort of militaristic exclusivism of Christianity that explains why it dominates most of the world. If it had been tolerant, like if it had been like other mystery religions, which allow you to have multiple beliefs, then we wouldn't have that. We would have multiple. We would be pagans now. Some of us would like prefer Christ over Mithras or whatever, but that wouldn't. No one would think like you're doomed if you're not Christian. Nor would anyone put a gun to your head if you said otherwise, right? And it's that kind of sort of militaristic thing that is essential, but also
I think
the
that's
exclusivism.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think that's what I was thinking of, is compared to the other mystery cults of the time.
Yeah.
I'd heard people could be in, Adonis cult and Osiris cult, and they could travel around and participate in these religions. But when it came to Christianity, there was a certain authoritarianism and,
and this, there are scholars who've made this point. Like Rodney Stark is a sociologist.
Wondering what that being the case, what role do you think that played in its?
No, 100%. Yeah, I think it's essential to.
I'm sorry for bragging.
Yeah, no, I think it's essential to the destruction of other religions. And I think the reason why we have Christianity as the dominant religion and Islam in another section of the world is this exclusivity, right? Like, it's like you can't beat both. And there are sociologists, not just Rodney Stark, there are others who have pointed out that this is actually an economic structure. So if you think in terms of like, suppose society and the law made it that you had to be an Apple user, not a PC user, right? So you think like you have to be exclusive. You can't be both. You can't have an Android phone and an Apple laptop, right? Like, so like if everybody like shunned you if you didn't do Apple, right? Like if it, and if the government even like punished you, like taxed you, like the Muslims do, right? Like do things like basically just pushing people to be one platform, then everybody would be an Apple user, right? Like eventually. And so whether it's religions or a computer, it doesn't matter. It's the same economic law in terms of like what happens. And so exclusivism actually gives you a massive advantage in terms of success, as long as you can hit all the other success markers. And that's why like monopolies are just absolutely destructive. Like they always win unless you oppose the monopoly. Like unless you outlaw monopolies, it's always going to end in a monopoly, right? Like someone's going to own everything and that's it, right? Like you're
Right.
done. So Christianity does the same thing. And there are sociologists of religion who pointed out that as models of religion, this has happened. And even like when you look at like Hinduism, you notice it's not open to like Roman gods or Native American gods or anything. It's very much isolated to Hindu gods. And then Hindu nationalism is built on this. You can't have other gods. So even though it's not monotheistic, it is still exclusivistic, right? Like you can't be both a Muslim and a Hindu, like, or at least that's frowned upon. Like you literally could do that, but
Yeah.
but the social system, the social pressure system doesn't let you, quote unquote. And so that's that leads to sort of Darwinian cultural success. Is like this, anything that like is destroying all competition or downgrading all competition or punishing all competition is going to dominate. And so that's just an inevitable sociological law. And so that's why we've ended up with like the shitty religions that we have today is that. So I'm going to do a blog about that, pulling my material out of Sense and Goodness, probably this month, maybe next month. I don't know. But I want to add, like, I want to shout out to the deconstruction movement, and that I'm glad you're doing that. And it's one of the things that I've been very impressed with seeing, and I'm so glad exists. In the last 5 years, this has become up a thing, right? Is that ex-Christians are doing deconstruction videos and talking about that as like, how do you transition out of Christianity? How do you like clear the baggage? Like all of that stuff, I think is so valuable, and is some of the most important work being done that I'm glad that's happening. And I often like rely on it and look at it and check out what's going on in that scene. So I just want to like chops that, right? Like for that. And also, like you said, you had like 900 questions. I know you're exaggerating, but if you do write them all down and just stalk me from show to show, like when I am on a show like this, and then pick the questions that are most relevant to the topic I'm talking about and show up and ask, like you can eventually get them all answered that way. So just FYI.
Oh, don't worry. I won't forget again. This is, I won't forget for next time.
Yeah, and I definitely plan on having Carrier back on to do a more general Q&A kind of thing in the future.
Sure.
And I'll have a better system set up then. I think the way that this is running tonight is really putting a strain on my system. If anybody is can't really listen to what's going on here because you're over on TikTok, this will be archived over on the YouTube side, and it'll just be me that's like all stuttery and shit, and Carrier will be crystal clear. So that's if you want to go and fully hear it over there, it's my bad.
Well, I'll drop down. I really do appreciate the time, Doctor. One last thing, as far as speaking to the movement you spoke about 5 years ago, I decided to do this, but didn't see that movement out there, didn't see the people out there. And it was partly you and John here who were a big part in giving me the courage and the inspiration to do it.
I'm so glad of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
so.
that's the kind of effect.
Thank you both. All right.
That's awesome to hear.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah.
Yep, it's working. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Mike. I'll see you later, okay? All right. So we did have a super chat come in before we get to our last person here. It's Kristen Hood. Hey there, Kristen, who says, become a Patreon of Dr. Carrier, and you can ask all of the questions.
Also true.
Don't forget to subscribe to GE. Happy weekend, guys.
Yeah, I so right
now, so let's see.
Really
yes, we did have Jason. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, it's my biggest income right now is Patreon. So and I think I'm gonna need it to survive the upcoming economic collapse. So I hope more folks will join my Patreon for like a small enough amount that they can survive. They can keep doing it when like the world goes to hell in a handbasket and keep me alive. So yeah, I very much appreciate people who are on Patreon and support me there. And there's like, depending on how much you give, there's bigger and bigger perks. But the fundamental perk for anybody who gives any amount is yeah, you do get to ask me all the questions you want. How to find me to get those questions is tricky. Lately my email has exploded, so it's completely unreliable. But if you're a Patreon member and you DM me questions on Patreon, I will see those within usually 2 weeks. So when I go back, I always go back because I do 4 long form publications. That if you're a Patreon subscriber, you are supporting universal free access without ads to my long form blogging, which is like a dinosaur medium, but it's needed because you need these sort of like detailed, long discussions of things. It's not over brief. It's not oversimplified. And so that kind of stuff, you got to link people too, because you got to read this. That's what I'm generating. So Patreon people are supporting that and basically benefiting the world. I've had people all over the world be grateful for this. I've had people from like Coptic Christians in Egypt have actually communicated with me and are so glad that my material is available for them. And so like that's just an example of like how you affect the world when you support my work. But yeah, the perks are a few. So even at lower levels, there's a few. You can find that at Patreon and things that you can get about that. One of which is that you can comment on my Facebook wall. So you'd have to tell me so that we can friend each other, and then because only friends can post on my wall on Facebook and comment on things there. So that's one perk. Another is that you can do automatic commenting on my blog so that it doesn't go to moderation. You immediately post. Sometimes I have trouble making that system work, but so far it's coasting. It's doing all right. But again, you have to tell me, like if you're a paying Patreon member, tell me, hey, I'm a paying Patreon member. Can I now get in the automatic blog posting? I would love to get more folks like that who engage a lot on my blog, so that when comments post on my blog, people who are like readers can like start engaging with critics and stuff like that. Because it can take me a week to like have time to go back and look at what's being posted. And so anyway, these are the perks that you can get that would also benefit me and benefit the community and things like that. So, and then of course, all the other ways, if you go to my blog and there's a how to help button at the top, you can click that. A lot of other ways that you can support me, like, buying my books and things like that. But, Patreon matters. So yeah, thanks for mentioning that and reminding everyone. For those who want to access all this stuff, all my social media, my blog, my books, my classes, I do online courses every month that you can also take. That's richardcarrier.info. So just my name.info. That's my website. Everything is there. And you can find it all. And so that's the way.
Okay. Yeah, definitely support Carrier. He definitely deserves it. He does a lot of great work. All right. So we've got Jason over here on Video Ninja, which I think I should have it working to where everybody can hear. But we're gonna find out. Jason, are you there? Carrier, can you hear? I don't think that you can hear him, can you?
I do not hear anything presently, no, just you.
No. Yeah. Hold on one second.
Okay, maybe now.
Yes.
I think so. Say something again.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Again? Okay. Yes. Okay. Hey, how's it going?
It's going all right.
Okay,
Going pretty good.
yeah, good. I have 3 things, but they're all on topic. So first thing is Second Esdras is 4 Ezra, 5 Ezra, and 6 Ezra. So I am curious how you sort of abandon this, because there's a very clear, and I said Second Esdras because I can't remember if it's in 4, 5, or 6, where the dying Messiah shows up. But there is a dying Messiah that shows up, and maybe it's 4 Ezra, I don't remember. But you mentioned it can't be Christian because the Messiah there, I can't remember, he died 400 years or something, and then he dies, or he dies and then there's 400 years. and then there's a resurrection. But I am curious why you sort of abandoned that one,
Oh,
because
yeah. Okay.
very clearly it's not Christian. That the civic
That's a
is not.
good question. The short answer is that there's a lot of literature on this, arguments among scholars, and when I look at it, it's just a fog of debate, and I don't see a resolution. So I understand the argument you're making, and there are scholars who make that argument, but there are also scholars who argue the opposite. And so right now, I see that as sort of an unresolved debate in the field. And I myself, like, I feel like for me to weigh in on that, I would have to do a whole separate article where I specifically deep dive all the literature on for Ezra and the things you're arguing and the people who are arguing against you are arguing and so on. I'd have to do a whole article just on that. And I am not confident right now that that would result in anything worthwhile. So like, and I don't know if I mentioned at the top when I priced it out, like in terms of what this article would have cost me if I, in terms of like the amount of hours that I spent, it's over $2,000 in terms of like the effort that went in. For me to spend that amount of effort on that subject, I'm balking, right? Like there are other things I would rather do, which is not to discourage other people from doing it. So I would love it if like someone with a PhD in a relevant field deep dive that question and sort of like could convince me, like go through all the arguments, look at all the literature and work it out and say, you know what? Yeah, we cannot dismiss this as a Christian interpolation. I would love that. It's just I myself have so many other priorities that I'm not going to be doing that. So what I do is I bracket it by just putting in a footnote in the article saying, look, this is unresolved. I haven't resolved it, so I'm not going to use it here. So it is important. It's good for you to ask that question because I'm not saying that you can't do it, that you can't cite it, and so on. I'm just saying that it doesn't. I can't go into it. I can't digress on it in this particular article because it's too complicated a question. Whereas the other stuff is much more clear cut. So I still do encourage people, like this would be a great dissertation subject if somebody goes into religious studies or biblical studies or something like that to do a deep dive on the for Ezra. Are there Christian interpolations and so on? So not knocking you on your case. It's just the reason is like sort of a pragmatic reason why I can't do anything with it in this particular article. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Are you still there?
Yeah. I think you're abandoning it too much. I think
sure, that's fair.
I think that
yeah.
the argument for its current dating is actually pretty bad. And there's actually a pretty good argument that it needs to be dated way later, after Origin, actually. And the problem is you can't actually date it after Origin because Origin meant it. So
Right.
it sort of obliterates the dating.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Well, here's the thing. Here's the problem with that.
I think it's worth pointing out that a lot of
let me just briefly point out the problem with that is that we have this problem with the Acts of Pilate too, is that we don't know what text Origin is referring to or what condition it was in. This is why the arguments are like, yeah, so the book might have existed, but what was in it, right? So like it obviously was written originally by a Jewish author, and the argument is that Christians then interpolated it, like fucked it up. And there's evidence of them doing this to the Talmud and other things too, right? So like we know of this. It's just those cases we can like rule out because we have enough evidence to do that. But with Ezra, we don't know. Like Origin mentions it, may even quote it, but he doesn't give us the whole text, so we don't know what text he was looking at. Again, this does not refute you. This doesn't like mean you're wrong. It just means that resolving this question is way harder than it sounds, and that's why I feel like this would require a whole extra article, and it's just not on my list of priorities for myself. But it's example like Richard Miller did his whole deep dive on the thing that he did. I would love it if someone did a deep dive.
I just want the fact that Origin mentions it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just want to point out the fact that Origin mentions it sort of destroys the dating. But it's too difficult to go into, and you guys have other things going on. But the other thing I want to point out that's really important with for Ezra is that they refer to angels as Lord. which is very important for the mythicist argument because that Adonai title is sort of the usage of it, the Jewish usage of it, is actually quite important to the wider argument.
Yeah, I think so. I have to point out
so
that
I'm
there's
going to switch
someone
to
I know is actually
Daniel.
working
Go
on
ahead.
this. Someone I know is actually working on that question. The role of angelology behind all of this, and that's another example of someone else carrying the water. I've done as deep a dive as I have the time to do and is necessary for my work. I do think there's a lot deeper diving that one can do on Jewish angelology, like especially pre-Christian Jewish angelology. There's stuff there that I think is underexplored. I know someone who's really working on this, and my hope is that someday they'll come out with a really great book on this. That's the kind of thing that I have to hand off to someone else. Like I can't get into that myself. But yeah, your thinking is not ridiculous. I want to give you affirmation in that fact. Like you're thinking in a direction that many other scholars have also been thinking, and so that's definitely, it's not a crazy crank thing. It's just too weak right now. It's too muddled. Let's say muddled is a better word. For me to do anything with it. Someone else has to perfect it, and then I can use it. That is my thinking there.
Okay. Anyway, I think that there is fertile ground there, but we can leave it at there.
Sure.
The second point is Daniel 9, 25, and 26. Daniel specifically has a definition for weeks, and I believe that sort of precludes 25 and 26 from being the same Messiah, because the time difference now explodes.
Yeah.
Because Daniel is trying to reinterpret Jeremiah, and so
exactly.
he extends
Originally,
the timeline.
That's right. Originally, that's the case, right? So, and I have an article on Daniel as a forgery on my blog, where I talk about this. So I talk about, well, what are the original authors doing? They're absolutely doing what you're thinking, right? But the thing is that they did that, and it didn't come true. So, 30 years later, 100 years later, exegetes had to well, okay, that didn't work. So clearly they must have meant something else, right? And so they start reinterpreting what the math meant. And that's when we get the combination of the so they're the ones who are combining the two messiahs. The original authors did not mean, or at least probably, in my opinion, and many scholars' opinion, the original authors did not mean those two messiahs to be the same messiah. But by the time we get the Dead Sea Scroll literature, they had to
Daniel redefines the timeline.
Yeah, of Jeremiah, right? Yeah,
I'm saying Daniel does that.
Yeah, originally.
Yes.
Well, I mean,
so when he refers to weeks,
be Daniel. Let's
be
clear,
very
right? But yeah.
Yes. I'm calling him Daniel.
Yeah. I understand. I just want to make sure.
I'm just saying he's already done it.
Yeah,
he's already done it. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
And
he's
yeah,
already
he does
done
mean
it.
these to be.
So
it's actually a reference.
It's easy to understand when he says weeks later.
Yeah, because it's supposed to be a reference to, I think.
I just mean to say that he redefined weeks. That's all. So his weeks are longer.
Weeks of years, and then he has this overlapping system of weeks, so that you have the first Messiah, I think, is supposed to be the original Jesus, which was the first high priest of the Second Temple. And then you have later, you get the last, in his view, high priest of the Second Temple, Onias. And his death would trigger this last 7 years. But it didn't happen, right? So things didn't result that way. So by the time we get 11Q13, the writers of that are living in a world where that version of events did not happen. So they are desperately reinterpreting Daniel. So they're no longer interested in what the original authors meant. They're coming up with something else. And so whatever they came up with, we don't know, because we lack 99% of the scroll. So it's a whole commentary on the last week or whatever of Daniel, his timetable, and we lack almost all of it. But the part so in there, they talk about, there's this guy, and they refer to even in the worst case scenario, they refer to the first Messiah. But the fact that they're placing the first Messiah at the end of the timetable means that they have already decided that the Messiah of verse 26 is the same guy as verse 25. That is not what the authors intended, but it's what these desperate reinterpreters had to believe, because it's the only way to rescue Daniel as not a false prophecy. And when I say this, this isn't my opinion. I mean, it is, but this is what all numerous scholars.
So
list
we
somewhere.
agree.
But,
We agree that
yeah, probably.
we agree that that 926 is probably the best person that they're talking about. I'm only just pointing out that I do believe that the authors of 11Q13 do think that 25 and 26 are different people, but I do think that 26 is the best option.
Yeah, but the thing is, they can't. It's logically impossible for the authors of 11Q13 to think that 25 and 26 are the same person, because they're placing the event of 25 at the end of the timetable, which ruins that. So it can't. It's literally impossible. And this is what Timothy Lim points out that
That's what I'm saying.
Abegg ignored.
I don't think that they're
Abegg didn't
placing
read
it at the end.
Yeah. So anyway, I actually discussed this in the article. So when it comes out, you want to check it out. I talk about Timothy Lim, many others. There's a whole list. I had a list somewhere, but I've kind of lost it in the maze of things. John, it's in the notes somewhere. Oh, here it is. Oh, I think this is it. Wait, hold on. Let me see. Yes. Oh, wait. Okay, so here's what I wrote. So George Brooke agrees with me on this. David Mitchell, Timothy Lim, Geza Vermish, Craig Evans, Dean Ulrich, Suk Young Kim, John Bergsma, Rick Vandewater, Michael Wise, Roger Beckwith, and James Tabor. I don't mention Tabor in my article. There's a long story as to why, but because it was a magazine article, not a peer-reviewed thing. But anyway, James Tabor also agrees. And then, of course, you have to include Lataster and myself. So yeah, and that's a long list of folks. But if you want to talk about the people who are Dead Sea Scroll experts, the first list is it's a lot of people, and it's all of them basically. There's not anybody. Abegg is literally the only one that isn't on. It didn't get the memo on this, right? He's the only one who doesn't even realize it, and he doesn't argue against it. He's not aware of this argument, which is weird because he cites Lim as supporting him, but Lim refutes him. In the article that he cites, which is really weird, but it is the case if you go checking. Anyway, so that's the thing is the 11Q13 cannot think that. They've clearly changed their mind about what Daniel 9 was doing. The original authors, though, you're right. You're tracking what the original authors had in mind, because they had this idea of overlapping timelines, not additive timelines. Which is also it's sometimes really hard to get people to understand that. I get a lot of pushback from different factions of Christians on this, because for different reasons they can't let that be the case. But no, it is the case. Andre Lecoq and others have demonstrated this. But my article on Daniel being false, Daniel being a forgery, goes into this backstory as to what the original authors were doing. And you're correct as to what the original authors were doing. But it's by the time we get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, they had to abandon it. Logically, they had to abandon it because it was proved false by that point.
Okay, I think we disagree on what the original authors are doing, but that's fine. I want to move on to my actual point that I actually think is interesting.
Okay.
So, the whole thing that we're talking about here is that Jews wouldn't have come up with this dying Messiah because it's just ridiculous and they don't like it. And so one of the ideas is obviously that there is not a lot of writings that are related to this, right? We don't have a lot. And as you point out, we just don't have a lot of writings, period. So it's not a
Correct. Yeah.
great argument. And then we also have several documents like Second Esdras, like 11Q13, where there actually might be a dying Messiah anyway. Plus, we also have Daniel 9:26, which literally the guy dies.
Yeah. Right.
My question is specifically when Paul is talking up, when Paul is talking up hey, you guys who are Gentiles, he's probably talking to, you guys are the smart ones, and the Jews, they're rejecting this Messiah, and this dying Messiah is the stumbling block. other than Paul sort of talking up the people he's talking to, telling them that they're smarter than everybody, which, I mean, like if you're a salesman, right? You see a guy and you're like, hey, you're a guy who knows his knives. You do that. That's a salesman tactic, in my opinion. So other than that, like, what evidence do we really have that it really was not successful with Jews? That they really did
Oh
reject it.
man.
I've heard people say that, like, oh, there's no archaeological evidence for it, but like, what archaeological evidence would there actually be that, oh, this entire community of Jews became Christians? It's like, do they just think that, like, oh, they would just all of a sudden start eating pork? Like, I don't understand what that actual argument is.
There's some authors on this. Sim. So I cite Sim in OHJ. Let me see here. Let me quickly get this. So what's his first name? Unfortunately, Sim is very common. Oh, here we go. Nope, that's not it. Why am I not finding it? Oh, here we go. Yeah, go to my bibliography. So the best author on this is David Sim. David Sim. So he wrote a book called The Gospel of Matthew and Christian Judaism, which is probably the best book ever written on Jewish Christianity, or early Jewish Christianity. And he has a chapter in a book called Matthew, James, and Didache, which is edited by someone else, and it has a bunch of chapters in it. But anyway, I cite both of those on the Historicity of Jesus, so you can find those there if you need the full citation. But he's the best, like, arguing about what happened to Jewish Christianity, why did it fail, and it's like one of the points that has to be the case is that it clearly was not very successful, right? Had it been more successful, Jewish Christianity would have been a bigger player in the development of Christianity in the late 2nd and early 3rd century. By the time of the 4th century, it's basically gone. And it's just all Gentiles. Now, there's a lot of debate that's kind of sound in terms of, like, why did this happen? Like, the Jewish wars, both of them are a big factor. Like, anti-Semitism is a big factor. The tax. So after the first Jewish war, Vespasian placed a tax on all Jews, whereby the tax that they used to spend, if you're a faithful Jew, you would give like a shekel or whatever the amount was to the temple to support the temple. He reverted it to the temple of Jupiter in Rome. So he basically taxed Jews. Now, if you're a Jew, and let's say 90 AD, and you can pay a tax, or you can become a Christian and stop being a Jew and not pay the tax, what are you going to do, right? So, like, a lot of Jews defected, or at least it's reasonable to assume a lot of Jews defected. Whereas the Jews, if you're a Jew and you're so fanatically Jewish that you're going to keep paying that fucking tax because you're like that loyal to Judaism, you're not going to become a Christian, right? So that's what happened, right? So basically the politics sort of created a sort of sieve that pushed Jews away from Christianity, or basically led them to abandon Judaism altogether. And then they just get melted into Gentile Christianity, right? Like the Jewishness goes away because it just gets dissolved essentially. And that's what happened, right? And so so the fact that there were no major Christian centers in Israel, in Palestine, right? Like Christianity was there's very little noise coming out of Christianity or very little noise coming out of Palestine as far as Christianity comes. There's some Christians there, but they are not dominant. They are not running things there. And of course, this gets into the Jewish wars too, because there's a lot of like genocidal shit going on. Like a lot of Jews are being killed. A lot of Jews are being shipped off to Persia as slaves. So like the damage done in Palestine to Judaism was pretty severe, even after the first war. And then it gets worse after the second war. And then it becomes super unpopular to be Jewish, right? Because now the Jews are like the national enemy.
Yeah, but
and so anyway, there's an
think that
incentive to run to Christianity.
You're talking about Roman.
But you have to explain, like,
You're talking
why
about
did
Roman
mainstream
interactions with
Christianity-
Judaism, but
But that's the
Romans
thing.
are
Is
not
like,
going
why
to
did
distinguish
mainstream
between Christian and
Christianity
Jews.
become? Yeah, why did mainstream Christianity become anti-Semitic? Like, so why over the course of the 2nd century, Christianity became very anti-Semitic, like badly, and then by the time you get to like the 4th century, it's super bad, because Jewish Christianity failed. Like, it just wasn't successful enough to compete with Gentile Christianity, and so they got pushed out essentially and denigrated as heretics. And so insofar as there were any of those enclaves surviving, they survived outside the Roman Empire, which relates to how the low chronology or high chronology, depending on how you refer to the terms of Christianity, where like you have the different version of Jesus who gets executed under Alexander Jannaeus 100 years before Pontius Pilate. That version of Christianity, which is Jewish Christianity, not all Jewish Christianity, but Jewish Christianity outside the Roman Empire, that's in the Mesopotamian region, right? And we can even locate it even more precisely than that. But it's a shrinking, failing version of Christianity, and that's the only version that shows up in the Talmud, because the Talmud was written in Babylon. The Talmud we have pieces of the Jerusalem Talmud, but the complete Talmud we have is from Babylon. The only version of Christianity they know is the Alexander Jannaeus setting, where Jesus is 100 years before Pilate, and is killed by stoning and then hung, and the whole deal. And so that's coming from a Jewish Christianity wing outside the Roman Empire. But clearly that failed too. So like that, there's no survival of that in the Mesopotamian area. It has like a few vague references in the Talmud as people like fringe cultures that the Talmudic Jews were against, but then it died out, right? Like, so that's if you add up all of these examples, like Jewish Christianity just failed essentially. And a lot of it, like I said, a lot of it is not just inherently not the Christian message, because you started with Paul. That's the thing, is like Paul's dealing with the situation before the Jewish war. Once the Jewish war happens, like it's all fucked after that. When Paul's preaching, like he has a shot, right? Like there's a chance for his movement to become mainstream or to become widespread. It just got crushed. It just got annihilated in the Jewish war. Like all hopes that he had. He was dead before then, so he didn't get to see that happen. But his movement died. His idea of bringing Jews in died. His idea of bringing Gentiles in took over and just dominated. After the Jewish war, it was all over at that point. But when Paul was doing this, he was very big into like integrating Gentiles and Jews. He wanted to see a universal religion that sort of like eliminated the distinction between Jews and Gentiles. It just became everybody could just be a Christ follower and so on. That was his vision, and I think he really believed that. Like I think he thought that would make the world better. It would solve the world's problems. Like I think that was what motivated a lot of what he did. Other than money, there's a lot of evidence that money was motivating what he did. But insofar as he had any sincere beliefs, I think he did think that the message would work, that he could unify these two groups. But his whole vision was crushed by the Jewish war, and that was the end of that. When it comes to the stumbling block, like you kind of misrepresented that. When Paul says this, he says we preach Christ crucified, to the Gentiles foolishness, to the Jews a stumbling block, but to some Gentiles and some Jews they're cool, they join us and they're cool. So like the significance of that is he says some Jews are okay with it, some Gentiles are okay with it, but most Gentiles were like, that's stupid, fuck off. And then some Jews are like, I don't get this. And your assumption, which is similar to Bart Ehrman's assumption, is that the stumbling block is the dying part. I'm not convinced that's true, and that isn't what he explicitly says. It's a theory. It's a hypothesis about what he means. I have a different hypothesis. I think what he is referring to is the thing that he doesn't mention, which is he has no evidence for this, that it's a bunch of these like mystics had these revelations and are going around. In Romans like 16, he says like, well, the revelation of the mystery of the teaching of Christ, hidden in the scriptures. So he's got all these like wackadoo Bible code theories, and he's got like, but he talks to me in my head, and that was very typically what Gentiles made fun of religion. It's like, yeah, you're fucking revelatory scripture shit. Like that's crazy bonkers tinfoil hat stuff. Fuck off, right? So that's what he means by foolishness, is that you're just a fool. The Gentiles are reacting to the mystical Pesher logic of Christianity. Like, it didn't make any sense. Now, the Jews would not balk at the Pesher logic or the revelation because they're all on board with that, or at least many of them were. but that's why he doesn't say, the Jews don't say it's foolishness. The Jews say for the Jews it's a stumbling block. So what is that? What are they stumbling on? I suspect they're stumbling on something else about the evidence that they're presenting. It's not the idea of the Messiah dies. Like, you could sell that, but you need better evidence that he was actually a Messiah. I think that's the thing they're stumbling on. It's like, look, I've been raised in this tradition, or I was convinced of this particular sectarian position, like Josephus says. I tried different sects. I picked this one. And this guy comes along and says, hey, God told me that you're wrong. Well, that's a stumbling block, right? It's like, well, I understand that God could have told you that. I'm just, you got to prove it to me. And then you go through the scriptures and you do this complex exegesis. It's like, I don't know, I'm having trouble. And you see this example in Galatians 3, where Paul is having problem reconvincing Galatians he's converted, that the scriptures support his version of things. And so he's saying, didn't you see in the scriptures, like, here's the thing, etc. Like, why are you like all confused? Why are you stumbling? I don't think he uses the exact word stumbling, but it's similar, like a similar concept. I think it's something other. It's not the dying Messiah that is the stumbling block. I think it is the exegesis, the mysticism and stuff that is stumbling. Jews have preconceived notions based on the sect that they've invested in. Many sects, not just a single one. Trying to get them to change sects is the stumbling block. I think that's the problem. It's not the dying Messiah part. But again, that's a hypothesis. We don't know, because Paul doesn't explicitly say what actually were they stumbling over. We can only imply that from examples like Galatians 3 and things like that, where we're running into examples, like actual material examples of what the stumbling is. Even like Galatians 3 and 4, like talk about like what were some of the stumbling blocks and things like that. So anyway, my point being is, like, I think that's less clear than people are assuming. And a lot of people do assume that. I think, like, people do say things like what you're talking about. I'm less convinced, essentially.
So Paul does actually say what the stumbling block is. He says that it is Christ crucified. So
no, he says we preach
obviously
that.
whether or not that means
we preach that. Yeah,
like,
that's the thing. Is like, but what are they stumbling over? Are they stumbling over the crucified part, or are they stumbling over the evidence for the crucified part? Right. So that's the problem. Like, we're not really sure. He doesn't get explicit as to the actual thing they're stumbling over. He just says we preach this thing, and there's a stumbling block, but he's not clear. It's very ambiguous, is what I'm saying. And so when you look at like the evidence, the things that people stumble over don't appear to be the dying part. They appear to be the other parts. What's that? Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Yeah, I was just saying, surely it's the thing that Christ is crucified, which is
well,
which
but so well, hold on. I just, and maybe Carrier can correct me, but like the whole idea of Christ crucified is a bit broad as far as what, because it's not, I'm looking at it right now and it's not specific about it. Like, Christ crucified, like, there could be several things that are stumbling blocks. It could be the death part. It could be the crucifixion part. It could be just the Christ part, right? Like, just the whole idea that Christ has come. Maybe that's a stumbling block to the Jews because they don't believe that Christ has come. There's several different ways in which this stumbling block could be there, but there's just simply not any kind of like, as I'm looking at it, there's no specific thing that would indicate exactly which part of Christ crucified,
So
is the
I
stumbling
disagree.
block.
I think
Exactly.
it's the crucified part.
No, I can give.
It's the crucified part.
I can
It has
explain
to
why
be.
this.
It's
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't.
That's
So look, let's walk this. Let's
there's
walk through this.
implications of being crucified.
Yeah, but let's walk through this. So Romans 9:32. If you look at that, he talks about the stumbling stone. They're stumbling over the stumbling stone. What are they stumbling over there? It's not the death of Christ. It's the fact that the death of Christ atoned for all sins, right? So it's they pursued by faith versus works, right? The idea that Christ absolves people of having to follow the law. So that's what Paul says in Romans 9:32. When you keep going, you look at all the other references to the stumbling block. It keeps being that. There's something about the atoning function of the crucifixion that is the stumbling block for his Jewish interlocutors, his opponents, etc. It isn't the dying. He never says the dying is the problem. He says that what did the dying do? That's the thing that you're having a hard time explaining to them, or the hard time convincing them of. Like, and this is where you get like the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, where he says, he died to atone for all sins. He says that's the thing that he's having a hard time explaining to Jews. And this is really the whole letter of Galatians about this, right? Where he's talking about like Jewish Christians are coming back to his congregations and saying, you have to be kosher. You got to circumcise. You got to follow the dietary laws. And he's saying, no, you don't. No, you don't. And he like elaborately, like there's this, like it is some serious, like there's some serious infighting over this. And he's seriously arguing over it. He spends multiple chapters arguing this point. The one thing that never comes up as a thing he has to argue is that the dying is a problem. He never has to oppose that argument. The argument he has to oppose is that the dying atoned for sins. That's the part that is everybody's stumbling over. That the idea that it eliminated the need to follow the law. That's the thing that he's talking about in terms of the stumbling block. So when he says like we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, I think when he says we preach Christ crucified, that's code for the entire creed, right? Like he's not saying the crucified part is the thing they're not saying that Jesus was crucified. That's it. We're done. Well, let's walk away. No, he was crucified to atone for sins. That's the whole creed, right? If the crucifixion didn't do anything, then it would not convert anybody. So like his argument is that the crucifixion has some sort of salvific function. That's the stumbling block. It's the function of the crucifixion. Convincing them that has done the thing is the thing. So like, and when you look at all the references to stumbling blocks in Paul, and all his arguments against his Jewish opponents, Jewish Christian opponents, by the way. So like these are Jews who are kosher, who are Christians, are trying to convince his congregations that they also need to convert to Judaism. And Paul is the guy who innovated this idea that you didn't need to do that you could continue being a Gentile and still get the salvation of Jesus. So this is the argument that is all over Paul's letters constantly. But the he died part is never an argument that Paul has to win. It never comes up. So I think that's why I think when we see that line, if you could take it out of context, you get that result. But when you put it in context, the dying part is never the problem for Paul. He never has to argue that. He never has to defeat an opponent on that point. It's the what did the dying do part, that it was sufficient to achieve certain goals. That's the stumbling block, and that's every single time in Paul's letters. So that's why I think that's a faulty assumption. Now, to be fair, like a lot of scholars do share your assumption. Bart Ehrman, I quoted him in my slideshow. That's his assumption, that is the stumbling block. And you can make the point that even if that was the stumbling block, Paul shows that some Jews didn't stumble over that. Some Jews are like, yeah, I get it. I see where you're coming from. Most Jews didn't. That totally tracks. So there's the fact of the success of the thing, the fact that they were stumbling does not itself disprove that the dying Messiah was the stumbling block. It totally could have been. It just wasn't universally a stumbling block. I just don't think that assumption is even defensible. And I think there's a lot of evidence against that assumption when you start looking at that stuff.
I think that
Well,
the key objection between us is that I'm not saying that it's the dying. I'm saying it's the crucifixion, because the crucifixion, if you crucify a person, you are cursed. It is a contradiction to be a cursed person who is also a Messiah, aka a chosen.
That actually hasn't been what we're arguing about.
Right. Well, hey, Jason, I'm so sorry about this, but well, I was just going to say, we do need to wrap up, and I'm so sorry to Nate. We're not going to be able to get to you tonight just because this has kind of gone on for quite a while here. I do need to go, but I appreciate you joining up, Nate, over there. Jason, we're going to interact on this very last point, but then we got to head out. Okay.
Yeah. So the thing is that the word crucifixion that in Paul is the same word used of Jewish executions. And that was actually essential to the atoning function, right? So this implicates atonement is the problem, right? Is the stumbling block. It's the same thing. So we get this in Galatians as well, right? So he talks about becoming a curse is part of what, like becoming completely humiliated and defeated. This is in Philippians 2, is what is necessary to atone for the sins. So the fact of being properly
We
formally
agree. We
executed.
agree that it is foolish to do that.
Yeah, but that isn't what Gentiles thought was foolish. What Gentiles thought was foolish is these religious nutcases trying to sell them on an oracle shit. They don't believe, they're rationalists. They don't buy into that. That's the thing that Paul's talking about is foolishness. The Jews had a different reaction. The Jews did not think this is foolish. This is the thing. That's what he says. Like, they don't classify it as foolish. This is like a reasonable point. It's just I'm stumbling, right? Like, I'm not convinced by what you're saying. I get what you're saying. I'm just not convinced by it. That's a different reaction. So that actually shows that Jews were actually receptive to this idea. But I think the idea is not the dying part. I think there's a lot of evidence against that. But I do think like clues to this come from when you just read the letters of Paul. What arguments does he have to defeat?
I agree.
What
But
arguments
you
does he
keep saying
never
that we disagree
have
about the
to
dying.
defeat?
We only disagree about the position.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. Well, anyway, yeah, that's my closing point on that. And I guess this is tangentially related to the topic of the day. So, yeah. Oh, other folks who have questions about
a
the
little
article.
bit. I mean, I do remember
People who have questions about the article. I have a blog that I just put up. It won't. It's currently the current blog, but it'll fall down the chronology. But the blog about this article, if you post comments, even if you're not a Patreon subscriber, the comments will go to moderation, but eventually they'll get through. Post comments there, your questions about the article and the thesis, and that's the best way to like follow up on this, because that one article is the best like stopping point to like keep arguing and talking about this. If you have questions about the article that I've been talking about today, just I want to let people know that, because that's the best place to keep following up.
Yeah. Jason, thank you so much for requesting up and having some really good questions for Carrie. Really, maybe you can request back up another time I have Carrie here, or if you want to interact with me on any of these topics, I'd be more than willing to field any very general sort of surface level understanding of it. But I appreciate you requesting up and having a good conversation there, bud. Yeah, I'm gonna drop you now, but thank you so much, and I'll talk to you later. Okay, Jason. All right. Bye. Okay, let me close that down. Okay. Yep, that's closed.
So you have Video Ninja as well. That's three things.
Okay.
Three things.
Well, that was also on stream. I think that we covered a lot of great, despite. Yeah, just three things, and it took about 45 minutes. So we did have a couple of super chats to address before we leave out. First, Tucson Keg says, "What about the Spanish Inquisition?" Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Let's see. Dyslexia says, "I just found out that I'm 30% Ashkenazi Jew through hospital testing. Where do they come from? My Irish Catholic family is going to be pissed." Ha.
Not my thing. You have to Google that one. I don't know. Don't trust AI, but
yeah,
there's real stuff to look at.
Yeah. And then Carissa Wayland, thank you so much for becoming a shill over there on the YouTube side. Carrie, again, thank you so much for coming on. I really enjoyed the presentation. I've also enjoyed the article. I've been reading it. I'm a slow reader, but I've made it about halfway through the article. I'm planning on continuing through the article. I already kind of knew a lot of information about this. Of course, you're going a lot deeper into it, but also, right. I'm trying to write my few articles about stylometry, and so it's helpful to see like an actual article that's published. It's going to help me sort of monkey see monkey do it, and so I'm looking at that for that, which I know you said that you helped me with my articles, and so I'm really trying to get that done.
Cool.
But we're going to go ahead and get on out of here. If you will, please, I'm going to update the description with Carrier's information. It's just richardcarrier.info. If you want to go and support Carrier over there, he really, deserves all of the support that he has and that he should get. Let me go ahead and
I put the link in to the studio chat. You can check that. To the article that is about my article. And that is the best link to send people if you have more questions. Just post comments. They might disappear into moderation. Don't worry, I'll get to them eventually, and they'll publish, and I'll have a reply.
Okay. Yep. I'm putting that in the description on YouTube right now. Because it doesn't work the same way over there on Facebook or TikTok. But
Right.
yes. I really appreciate everybody. What I'm going to go and do is I'm going to go and watch a scary movie with my son. Dr. Carrier,
Awesome.
It's always great having you on, and hopefully we can schedule something here in the next couple of months to do more general kind of Q&A type thing.
Get in touch.
Let's see.
You bet.
And,
I would love
ended
to.
the poll over there on. Yeah. Awesome. I think that's going to be it for us tonight. I'm going to go ahead and end this. Y'all have an awesome weekend and everything, and I will see you heathens later. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.